If the board members could just check their mute button, please.
I'm here.
Gracie Post,
Hi, thanks, Rich.
Norm Holcomb,
Norm's
Mike
mute.
Forrest,
I'm here.
and Mike Stone.
I think Norm is still muted. Okay, he's fine. I don't hear anything from Norm. There you go. Okay. Good evening. For the record, this is May 5th of the year 2020. The May 5th, 2020 meeting of the Yarmouth Board of Selectmen is about to be convened. As a precautionary measure to reduce the spread of coronavirus, all town buildings are closed to the public. Therefore, this meeting will be held by remote participation. My name is Mike Stone, Chairman of the Board of Selectmen. I'll begin by seeking a motion to conduct this meeting via remote participation and take a roll call for a quorum. Do I have a motion to conduct this meeting by remote participation?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
I was wondering, we almost didn't have a meeting. Okay, we'll take a vote on this. Norm?
Aye.
Eric?
Aye.
Tracy?
Aye.
Mark?
Aye.
I vote aye as well. So the meeting will proceed via remote participation. In addition, Town Administrator Daniel Knappich and Acting Assistant Town Administrator Rich Bienvenu are present at this meeting, as well as our Finance Director Ed Centeo and other members of the administration and the Health Department. Pursuant to Governor Baker's March 12th, 2020 order suspending certain provisions of the open meeting law pursuant to Chapter 38, Section 18, and the Governor's March 23rd, 2020 order imposing strict limitations on the number of people that may gather in one place, this meeting of the Yarmouth Board of Selectmen is being conducted via remote participation, as I previously stated. No in-person attendance will be permitted, but every effort will be made to ensure that the public can adequately access and participate in the proceedings as provided for in the order. Persons who would like to view this meeting while in progress may do so watching via this virtual meeting or the live via the town's YouTube channel. We will also post a recording of this meeting on the Town of Yarmouth website as soon as we're able to do that. Please be patient as we work to overcome any technological challenges with the virtual meeting. To reduce confusion during the meeting, all participants of the virtual meeting are muted by the host, who is Rich Bienvenu. As participants are called upon to speak, they will be unmuted. Members of the public attending or viewing this meeting virtually will be able to use the quote, raise hand, close quotes button to identify themselves when called upon. The host will then unmute your audio. If you are dialed into the phone number provided, you can press *9 on your phone to indicate you would like to speak. Please wait to be recognized before speaking. In addition, public comments may be submitted via email to publiccomment@yarmouth.ma.us. This account will be monitored during the meeting by the host and provided to the chairman as applicable. If you're called upon to speak during the meeting, please consider the following guidelines. Do not use a speakerphone. Do not use Bluetooth devices. Mute all background noises. Clearly state your name each and every time prior to speaking. All votes must be roll call votes. After a motion is made and there is a second, the chair will take the roll call vote. All motions, decisions, documents, and letters will be verbally read into the record. If it appears the meeting cannot or should not proceed, then the host will recommend that the chair request to continue the hearing to a later date and time and/or until public meetings can resume normally. As is our practice, we'll begin this meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America
And
to the republic which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Okay, we will begin our meeting. We've just come out of executive session. We'll start with public comments. Jim Cullen? Mr. Cullen, can you hear me?
I can, Mike, thank you.
Okay, you're on.
I had a couple questions about two items on the agenda tonight. The first, I'm from 8 Woodside Circle in Yarmouthport. The first item regards the regional guidelines that were in the paper last week. I did find them on the Cape Cod Chamber of Commerce website. And I guess I have two questions. Number one is would it be possible for the town of Yarmouth to put it on the town's website so that we year-round residents could see these guidelines, even though they're intended for seasonal visitors and seasonal residents? That's question one. And question two might be for Dan in regard to the possible vote. Since these were discussed in the paper and are now out in the public, I was inquiring about what that vote is about. And I'll stop there. And then I just had a question on the possible vote on the golf opening.
Mr. Chairman, if I could.
Sure.
So it was asked by the legislative delegation that's distributed that document to see if the town boards of selectmen would take a vote in support of that document. So that's why it appears on the agenda tonight. I just received it. I think it was on Friday.
Oh, so they kind of jumped the gun. I mean, when I saw
Well, I
it
think
on
it got published prematurely.
yeah, okay. But I guess I hope that we would support those since they seem to be widespread and there were a lot of logos at the bottom from legislative leaders and the healthcare people. So if you do vote to support it, and I would recommend as a citizen that we do to go along with everyone, that if it could be posted on our website on the town, I think that would be helpful because I'm gathering there's going to be more information coming out soon that might be helpful for us to know. So I would appreciate that. In regard to the golf opening potential vote, and it's always hard during public comments to ask questions when you don't know the discussion. So my question would be theoretical in that is the board considering opening the golf courses prior to May 18th? If the answer would be yes in that regard, my suggestion would be that you wait. I think everyone knows there's a tremendous amount of support for opening the golf courses. There's petitions out there. The governor's business task force, I understand, is reviewing proposals. And on the heels of the difficult meeting last week, I personally don't think it would be a great move for the town to jump the gun on the rest of the golf courses. It'll get I think some unneeded publicity. So I wanted to ask if the vote considering tonight might be regarding opening prior to the 18th. If that's out of line, I would just make my comment since I won't be able to comment later on when you do take up the agenda item. So those are the questions and the comments. And lastly, I do hope as we go on here in the next phase of reopening the economy in Massachusetts, that if there's any possible way for the board and the Board of Health and the health director to somehow get on the same page. I think it's important for all of us that we recognize the awesome responsibility you all have as a board to make these ultimate decisions. and to also collaborate with them because they have an important role in this conflict between the economy, the citizens' rights, public health, etc. It's, in my humble opinion, like I said in my email, it's just not a good look for we as the citizens. And I know it's a tough one. It's being argued at the very tops of our government. So I'll stop there and say thank you for hearing me out this evening.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, we have an unidentified phone caller who wishes to speak. Can that phone caller identify himself or herself?
School starts in the fall. I think it's so important for me to be on campus, be in extracurricular review with my professors and be with people in residential halls. That is just so important for me for a freshman year experience. Charlotte is one of a growing number of high school seniors.
You unmuted me, okay. Does anybody else want to speak on public comment?
Mr. Chairman, there's no comment on our email either.
We have an email note?
No emails, and the phone caller was unresponsive.
Okay, no emails and the phone call was not responsive. All right, so I guess we're ready to move on then.
Can I just say one thing, Mike?
Sure, Tracy.
I didn't even know how, a lot of people may not know how, but I just learned how to raise your hand. So in a group like this, if you hover over the participants and you click on the participants, there's the ability there to raise your hand. So if somebody wanted to interact with us, that's how they would do it.
Okay. All right, we have a new phone caller. With a number ending with 3378. Does that person wish to speak? If they do, please identify yourself.
Hello, it's Vita Morris.
Okay.
And
henceforth, you'll
I
be
guess-
known as 3378. All right. Go ahead.
I guess I'm going to be speaking of the subject du jour a little bit. I have a question. Is the DPW doing any street sweeping? Because I find that in certain streets just seem to be unkempt looking, and I certainly haven't heard any sweepers in my neighborhood, so I'm not sure. Plus, again, with the DPW, I've spoken to Jeff several times. For instance, on Strawberry Lane, there's a storm drain cover that is sinking and badly, and somebody throws a cone once in a while over it, and those of us who are aware of it always go around it, but there are people who are coming along who don't know about it. That's been in that condition for probably close to a year now. Is anybody going to do anything about it? On such a narrow lane, I wish, they would get moving on it.
Dan, do you know whether or not any street cleaning is being done?
Yes, it's on a limited schedule right now, so they are way behind schedule, but it is being done.
Oh, okay. So I guess we can expect. I'm talking about West Yarmouth Road, which apparently, it really is one of the bigger ones. And in the area of where the overpasses are, right as you're going south and approaching the entrance to Bayberry golf course, there are all these needles or something. It's just an unkempt look to it. And the same thing goes for once. You get into, let's say, a White Rock area on the street there. It's just all these dead branches that are lying around, and nothing's being done. This isn't the first season that has happened. So anyway, so that's okay. So they're doing the work, I guess. But why is the schedule limited? I mean, it's not like it involves people who need to be distancing. It's just one person, isn't it, running the sweeper?
We had a serious amount of vacancies in the highway department, so we are behind on a lot of different topics, plus the finishing off of, I call like street excavating. We have some streets that have to be, the dirt streets have to be leveled out, and then tornado cleanup put a big dent in our labor as it relates to the schedule. So we'll catch up to it. I'll see what I can do about publishing a list.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Vita. Anyone else? Okay, the first item are COVID-19 updates for fiscal 20 budget impact.
Yeah, so I've asked Director Murphy to briefly let you know what the status of testing is. I sent you out an email just before the meeting. So he's on the call now.
Bruce?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Bruce Murphy, Director of Health. As I'm talking to Dan today, the update on today is we had 6 new positive cases come in today, Tuesday. Yesterday, Monday, we had 3 positive cases come in, and Sunday we had 5 positive cases come in. That's the most 2-3-day number of cases that we've had come in since the coronavirus, came into Massachusetts, into Yarmouth. Our overall number of cases is 83. We have 27 positive cases that we're following. We've had 2 deaths and 54 people have recovered. We provide the police and fire department each day, and as it updated with the positive cases in town, the addresses, to keep them current in their first responding duties. From looking at the Cape Cod Healthcare zip code map that they publish during the week, based on yesterday's results, just to get an idea of what's happening in Yarmouth zip code wise, for positive cases, West Yarmouth had 30, South Yarmouth had 21, Yarmouth Port 24. So it was pretty well evenly spread across the community. Let's see.
Bruce, can I just ask a question about those numbers? Are any of them, or can you identify any of them, or how many of them are in adult living or congregate living places?
Yes. Right now, we've been very good. We do not have any clusters in either of our 2 nursing homes or assisted living facilities or independent living facilities. They've been taking terrific precautionary steps. I'm in touch with them on a regular basis. And as of now, there is no clusters with any of those facilities.
Thank you.
I mean, that's good news, Bruce. In Pleasant Bay, they had like 2/3 of the population there that tested positive, last I heard. So that it apparently, when it gets into those facilities with older people, it runs rampant. I do note that these numbers of the last 3 days are significantly higher than what's been reported all along. Usually it's 2, maybe on a bad day, 3 cases. And here you got 5, 3, and 6. Shows, I guess, that it's still pretty serious out there in terms of infection.
Do we know though how many people are being tested in terms of a ratio of positives? Are we increasing the actual testing numbers that coincide with that at this point?
No, we do not. Most of the testing is through Cape Cod Hospital down at the community college. Some testing is going on at Outer Cape Health Facilities down Cape, and a few have been tested off Cape. So we don't have a direct number of testing per the number of people in Yarmouth. We do not receive that information.
Okay, anybody else have any questions for Bruce or any comments on anything that he has said so far? Okay. Bruce, I understand that from emails that you and Dr. Bosky wrote to me, and they were very short, and I don't have them in front of me, but you were looking for input from this board about planning about an eventual reopening of public facilities. Is that correct?
Yes, we had mentioned whether we wanted to, the two chairmen wanted to get together, myself and Dan, just to talk about what upcoming reentry plans might be and how we can all work together.
Okay. I'm just wondering how I can, in anticipation of a meeting like that, get input from our board. When did you think that such a meeting could take place? What did you have in terms of a time frame?
Well, we're available this week anytime. And, you know, one of the questions is upcoming town events or events on town property, how they're going to be looked at going forward, you know, when you're going to be looking at allowing them or canceling them. You know, that'd be one question, you know, the position the selectmen will be taking on upcoming events on town property.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I might.
Go ahead.
The state is telling us that they're working on a municipal package of information, should be out in the next couple of weeks, related to things that affect specifically towns and cities, government buildings, beaches, parks. And what I'd like to be able to do is hopefully we'll get a indication of what some of those requirements will look like in advance of an announcement by the state. We're starting to put together an in-house team based on what it is we know now. They'll meet for the first time tomorrow to start talking about what we pretty sure we need to do. But to Bruce's point on public activities, we do have a calendar started, and most of the applicants that would normally put on an event have already canceled those events, and we will update you at the next meeting as to the status of those things. For instance, the annual sheep shearing festival at the Taylor Bray Farm has been withdrawn. Maureen Toomey, we discussed with her the other day what a Memorial Day ceremony would look like. It's going to look like a drive-by.
Right, yeah.
Cars, you know. The farmers market is something that we do have state guidance that could go on, and we're working with, I think, Pat Armstrong and Bruce and Karen Green to come into place what information we can provide to the farmers market associated with that. But and as you know, the Ragnar Road Race Relay that I think it was going to be scheduled for Mother's Day weekend, they pulled out on their own. So most of the big activities are just pulling out on their own. And then I know Pat Armstrong's on the meeting here, and many of the recreational camp related activities and things we normally do at the beaches, we're on a wait and see approach to see what the state has to say. They're supposed to, like I said, issue some guidance to us in the next couple of weeks.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question on that.
Go ahead, Eric.
Dan, don't we already know what the state has to say by virtue of the new mask order? The state has said stay 6 feet apart or wear a mask.
Well, there is that. That is an issue that's gonna have a role to play in all of these things. But say something as long as like the beach opening. What does a beach opening look like?
Looks like opening the gates and saying it's okay to walk there. Wear your mask and stay 6 feet away from
Well,
people.
so my understanding is that they're going to take a look at density by the square footage of your beach location and then identify how many people you could safely have. And it might include what they did in Wellfleet the other day, where they just cut off access to a daily payers parking lot up at Whitecrest Beach. So all of those details are sifting through, and we, as part of the Cape Cod communities, sent along a request for more specific guidance on these issues to the state today. So I would hope that within the next, maybe by next meeting, I have a little bit more to tell you, but certainly by the one after that.
Well, what's the purpose of listening to the state guidance when our Board of Health we're not consistent with it? It gives a confusing message.
Well, so that is a discussion to have, that when, for instance, if golf is allowed to open up beyond or before May 18th by the state or whatever the state says to do. It sounds like, based on communication we've had, that the state said, we'll leave it up to local boards of health to decide in their own governing bodies on how to enforce these things, but this is what we're saying. So I think
My point is that a closure and a mask order are conflicting. Why have a closure when you have a mask order?
I didn't issue the mask order. I can't answer that question, but.
I mean, it doesn't even make sense. The mask order clearly says maintain social distance, and if you can't, wear a mask. So why wouldn't that override a closure? You can clearly open up the beaches and tell people to maintain 6 feet of distance, and if they feel that they can't, they need to wear a mask.
I think it's going to be more restrictive than that. There's going to be additional guidance that limits the amount of people physically on beaches, just like they do with occupancy in supermarkets right now.
And what's that? You can go to BJ's and there's 100 people.
It's
indoors.
40% of the allowable occupancy, including employees. So if BJ's is permitted for 300 people, they can have up to 40% of that.
It doesn't even make sense. You can have 100 people inside a grocery store, but you can't have people walking on a beach staying 6 feet apart or wearing a mask. I mean, this is foolishness.
Bruce, do you want to respond to that?
I was on the conference call with the Department of Public Health today, and they did mention, as Dan said, they are coming out with working recommendations for beach operations, and I'm hoping that they'll be out by this week or next week, and that way we can look at them along with any other recommendations that can come out through the governor's office. And the Board of Health has a meeting on Monday, and that's one of the topics that they'll be discussing.
Isn't the county also working on similar things? Don't they have a committee? I think I read that they have a committee consisting of various people in the business community, the Chamber of Commerce and so forth, trying to figure out what a reopening of community businesses and activities would look like. And I think they're meeting to discuss similar issues as the state is looking at.
You are correct. You are correct. I was on a county call today with the health agents, and there is a task force between the Barnstable County Health Department, Cape Cod Chamber of Commerce, and several other health agents on the Cape to look at openings of businesses. And in particular, the beach question came up, would be one thing they're looking at, along with other businesses that will be able to start to open.
So I'm wondering if rather than working on our own, if we can at least tap into what the county's doing.
Well, that's the problem, Mike. This is getting completely confusing for people to follow the rules. one town's one thing, one's another thing. The state's doing it now, our delegation's doing it, the county's doing it, the town's doing their own thing. It's
One advantage, though, I think, for getting input from the county is they're dealing with very similarly situated communities, whereas the state's dealing with cities and, you know, farming communities, more rural communities, beach communities, whereas the county would probably be pretty much dealing with all beach communities and consolidated.
whose recommendations supersede whose recommendations is my point. At the end of the day, I'm not saying that they don't have a lot of knowledge of our local economy. It's true. But for people listening to all the different layers, it gets very confusing. So I hope whatever they come out with, they are streamlined with what the county is going to make rules to institute, and then the towns are going to make rules, and then the governor's going to make rules. Which ones do you follow?
Well, I think at this point, the governor's task force on reopening is taking commentary from all these different sources, including the individual towns, the county, the chambers of commerce, individual business groups, and they're going through all that information. So to a large degree, what we've been told is if you have a plan that you would like to have the state consider, send it along to them for consideration. So the municipalities on the Cape have worked with the Mass Municipal Association to put in front of the governor's task force specific instruction to deal with our situations out here, just as you've all talked about, and that the messages are related to what would make appropriate sense for a tourist economy. So there are a lot of different multi-layered conversations going on, and we'll see if we can catch up to a couple of them in the next couple of days.
Okay, anyone else on FY20 budget impact from COVID-19? Before we move on to the real issue here, which is the fiscal year 21 budget as it's impacted by COVID-19. All right, let's go on to fiscal year 21. Rich, you're going to start that discussion?
I'll let Dan kick it off, and then I'm sure he'll kick it over to me.
Yeah, Ed and Rich, you've been working over the last couple of weeks to provide what I would call a maximum level of flexibility for your consideration as it relates to what FY21 will look like. So just prior to the meeting, a memo was sent to you relative to those items. And the idea there would be is what we'd like to be able to get out of tonight is your sense collectively as what are those things that you would definitely not want us to consider to cover the gap, if you will, in the budget. For instance, borrowing from conversation from last week, use of the roadway override was not a particular popular option. However, that being said, we'd like to be able to know for sure if that's off the table for consideration to plug a potential hole in the budget. We'd like to know that so we can prepare the budget appropriately. So we have a more detailed list of additional funding sources that could be used for the upcoming year.
Was there an outline of options in the packet?
There is. Towards the last couple pages. Second to last page.
So I know you're just receiving this late. We completed, been working with Ed to discuss the various approaches that we might have and we could consider.
Oh, you mean the second to last page of what's on the screen, but nothing that we've gotten?
No, you have it. I sent it to you just before this meeting started.
Oh.
But it's,
Yeah, it wasn't part of the packet. It was emailed.
Yeah, I mean, they were still working on this late today, so I apologize for the lateness of it, but it's a lot of effort.
I'll just kind of go through a couple of the highlights. You can read the memo, and I'm sure we'll have further discussion on this, on the various points. But we did want to provide a matter of context. That's one of the paragraphs here about a normal economic downturn, such as they were, is looking for reductions of typically between 10 and 12%, or 8 and 12%. And that's in fact what we experienced back in 2010. So we have experienced about a 12%, just under a 12% decrease in local receipts back in 2010. However, we were able to take advantage coming out of that downturn of increasing our meals tax rate to the maximum at that time. However, a 10, 12% scenario isn't what we're considering at the moment. We're looking at the potential of a 25% or potentially larger reduction in local receipts with some reduction in state aid. And so, and just like in a typical downturn, we're expecting this to be a, hopefully maybe not as a long-term event as a full economic downturn might be, but certainly at least a 2-year recovery, perhaps longer. But to the good side, we do have some greater financial flexibility than we did back in 2010. But we have to be measured in our approach in using that. Ed and I have kind of gone through some of our options and put them on a one-page piece of paper for your consideration, which we'll get to in a second. The starting point is we did have a balanced budget coming into this spring with some unused levy capacity. And so as we go through those, we're starting with that budget that you've previously had gotten some presentations on as kind of the starting point and then backing off from there. And so there's a table attached to this memo on showing some revenue reduction amounts. I'll go through that in a second. And then a listing of budget measures we could take. And then some commentary from our perspective as far, and again, this is for the Board of Selectmen to provide some direction. But in our contemplations, as we've laid out, we haven't assigned any values to some more severe measures that you might want to consider or may have to consider, which would include layoffs or furloughs or cessation of certain activities. If we need to get there, then we can certainly start discussing what those look like and how we'd go about doing that. But we wanted to get what we have now with some relative values associated with those in front of you. I did want to point out, in talking this out with Ed, back in 2010, Finance Department and the Highway Department had some reductions of, I think it was 4 and 8 positions respectively. And for, I think, none, I shouldn't say none, there's been some additions and changes over the years, but by and large, those positions have not been added back in the years since 2010. Other departments did have reductions. Some of those reductions, police in particular, were added back since that time. And we have added positions, most recently with the fire department, but those have been due to increased demand. This table represents what a value, dollar value reduction would mean based on local receipts. We're assuming a 10% state aid reduction throughout this scenario. That may or may not play out to be enough or accurate enough, but that's where we're starting from. And if you were to experience a typical reduction of 10%, coupled with that 10% state aid reduction, that would be a value of about $1.8 million. But for this exercise, Ed and I are targeting the 25% level at least to start. And that brings us to a $4.4,358,000 target that we need to provide for. And as we go through this exercise, we thought it might be prudent to even consider or contemplate even beyond that. And certainly then what's a second year or a multi-year of this situation look like beyond what we might be able to do to accommodate reductions of this magnitude. And so that's the next page in the handout. And this is summarized. There's certainly a level of detail that can accommodate this based on your discussion and how you'd like to see this go. Obviously, this yellow box here would be what's the target that you're trying to accommodate. If you're trying to accommodate $1 million, that could be accommodated by perhaps this items here listed as A. But if you're trying to get $4.5 million, then that's not going to cut it. We have to do further measures. And if you're trying to do, somewhere in a magnitude of a third or 33, 35%, then we're talking 6 million plus. And so here's a list of items. I've kind of categorized them to make it simpler. The first set of items being items that were previously added to the FY21 budget that we would no longer do. And then there's also a handful of, a couple of items in here that now that we're just a little bit further along in the budget process that we can adjust down to actual, and that represents these things, get down here at the bottom. I did have an error in the calculation. We're not cutting back any stabilization funding. I just had double counted our transfers from stabilization that was previously done for internal borrowing. And so that's being added back into the mix as well. Those items generate a little over $1 million. We have a category which I have as labeled as B, representing additional funding sources or reductions or reallocations. Actually, let me stop for a second and go back. Okay, I didn't put it there. Back onto B. So if we were to then utilize any unused levy capacity, that includes after applying other available funds. So as you know, there's various funding sources in our Article 2 budget that are read as part of the motion. Ferry tax funds for an embarkation fee, for example, wetlands protection funds, things like that. Generally have smaller amounts. We would really ramp those up and use them more fully than they have been to minimize impacts. In addition, we'd max out, our estimate is about 141,000 on enterprise fund cost allocations. Historically, for the last several years, we've been appropriating about $500,000 plus or minus, depending on the tax rate calculation. To balance out the overlay, a provision for overlay that provides for abatements and exemptions. Typically, that's we use anywhere between $300,000 and $400,000, so that was a little heavy. And so this reduction really kind of puts it down to a bare bones level. And our protection against that is we have these unused overlays from prior years that could help support that if we have a heavier than normal level for abatements or exemptions. And that's shown as a reserve item on a subsequent page. We'll get to that in a second. And then finally in this section, we'd be looking to work with the CEDC or CPC committee and our community development block grant to see how we can reallocate some operating costs that historically they might not have covered, but likely are eligible to be covered under these arrangements, and see if we can undertake those. If we were to do all those, that's another $1.7 million that would help to balance the budget. So a combination of those two items is $2.7 million, which is at the, if I scroll back to the, which gets us to about the 15% level.
Rich, could you explain the first two items in terms of what they are? What does maximized levy capacity mean?
So that was, as we go through and made all these adjustments for other available funds and increased enterprise funds, and plus what was unused coming into this, as we came out of where we thought we had a draft budget, we had unused levy capacity of 465,000. So this brings it up to the allowable levy without needing an override.
So we're going to increase taxes. Is that what you're saying?
Well, there was a tax increase before, correct, in the prior draft budget, but the prior draft budget without these other adjustments as well had unused levy capacity, and this would contemplate using that unused levy capacity to,
well, in other words,
but not require an override.
Well, just speak plainly. Does it mean that we would be increasing our taxes?
Correct. The 465,000, it would be the maximum allowable levy without needing an override, which obviously would be additional taxes.
Okay. So we'd be cutting a variety of things, but increasing our taxpayer, the taxes to our taxpayers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can I ask what the 60,000 veterans benefits, what does that represent?
So we went back and looked and just been monitoring this anyway for the last few years, but our level of benefits that we pay out to veterans through the Cape Cod Veterans District. We have an assessment we pay the Veterans District, but this isn't the assessment. This is the actual benefits paid out. Has been over budgeted and unneeded.
Okay.
And we did not reduce it at first, thinking that that might catch up, and it hasn't. It's been at the same level for the last 2 or 3 years. And so if it's not needed, then we're cutting it back.
Okay, so there's no adjustment in services. It's just a more accurate number.
Correct.
Okay. And in B, that 235 for the community development, the Tourism Revenue Preservation Fund, I feel like those businesses and those events are going to be extremely needed to help the businesses next year rebound. So to some extent, I'd hate to, well, I mean, I guess asking them to see how they feel, where they're at, what they need. But that's something I think that we're going to really have to work harder on, because our businesses have been extremely impacted by the closures that they're now facing.
So one of the things that Ed and I are working on, and Ed, I'm sure will jump in when I've finished kind of this summary, is looking at each of these funds and seeing what is available and unreserved. So for example, there is unspent funds within the TRPF. Perhaps not as much as was indicated in our records at the moment, because they might have some internal encumbrances against that, but that's part of what we want to discuss. Do they have any unspent money? And same with, CPC and even our own internal funds. Are there unspent funds that can be utilized to get you through a year or two? So it gives you some flexibility.
And going back to A, this 600,000 for wastewater, that was coming from which source? I just want to make sure I keep it straight. So that's going to take everything that we budgeted from several sources, or?
So those two were energy savings that we had anticipated for wastewater, as well as 500,000 was short-term rental tax, new short-term rental tax. Section C here, hiring freeze or limited hiring has already taken effect, and we do think we have several vacant positions. This is a range, of course. Some things you might feel you need to do, and others you might not, or you can defer. So none of these are hard and fast numbers. There's a range of numbers, and as we pursue each of these, we can hone in on the details of them. But this one in particular would increase as time goes on, because we do expect that there to be some attrition through retirements, people that they decide that they can't come back to work in the current environment, for example, any number of reasons. But at the moment, we think that there's probably $500,000 to be realized in savings by deferring hiring practices. We do have several part-time staffs that may no longer be needed, some expense accounts that can be dropped, and some hour reductions that we can put into place relatively easily. That'd be about $150,000 impact. We could cut further. We could cut some public safety overtime. Could further reduce departmental expense budgets, and it could impact our human service funding. And then finally, reflecting some significant cuts to budget and eliminating public safety training, and any other remaining departmental budget accounts would generate about $200,000 for a total of $1 million. And then finally, we're onto our capital budget. We've kind of talked about this a bit last week. That's a little over $3 million. Taken all together, I didn't get a chance to add in the subtotal. the total of all these measures comes up to about $6.8 million. And then talking to Ed, and I had a brief opportunity to meet with Mike when he came in earlier. An approach could be you adopt all of these, and we wouldn't think that's unreasonable. Maybe with the caveat of the total of these is 6.8 million. And if you came up with 6 million out of all of this, that brings you to, if I go back to that prior page, a 35% level. And then that leaves on the table is the planning efforts that would be associated with anything that needs to happen above and beyond that, which would be significant reduction of town programs and services or operations. And these are the various departments. All that being said, and I know Ed and I have had some back and forth on how we could effectuate this, we do have some reserves. And we think a prudent approach might be to take advantage of almost all of those options, but retain on the table that perhaps you can reinstate them if things look better than expected with some of these one-time sources. So for example, if you were to include the roadway funding as part of the emergency measures, so to speak, that might be the first thing you add back, and we've got other funds available under stabilization and free cash perhaps that we could use to reinstate those sooner rather than later, perhaps in the fall or next spring. But those are decisions that you could make at that time. I do have a couple I have a couple people in the waiting room that I'm going to admit to the meeting, so I'm just going to stop the share here for a second. Ed, did you have any comments?
No, Rich, I think that was a good summary. But if the board wants to go through it, but I guess one of the other things that we need to keep in mind is that we're going to be doing some significant borrowing in February. So things like the general stabilization, capital stabilization would be fine to use, but not general stabilization. And while we could use OPEB reserves to pay for retiree health insurance, that would also be the last thing that I would do to try to close a budget. Those two funding sources. So because we have a perhaps $16 million borrowing that we're going to do in, say, February, we then have up to $40 million for the school, and then we have potential for wastewater borrowing, so we could be in a position to start Route 28 for wastewater if that's appropriate. And there's some stimulus funding, and the state is going to go forward with the Route 28 project. So those are some of the things going forward that we have to look at. And, we have to be very conservative with free cash as well, because as Selectman Holcomb pointed out last week, if our revenues from real estate are down, then, we need to, be very cautious of, what we do from a free cash standpoint. We don't want to be in a negative free cash standpoint or situation. So we need to look at that closely towards the end of the fiscal year to see, if we need to go beyond the articles that we're considering closing now to actually avoid a negative free cash situation.
I guess one of the things we just wanted to highlight as Ed and I talked this out and we talked with others is this is really like nothing we've experienced before. Both Ed and I have seen declines and decreases, and as probably many of you have as well. And we can accommodate a 10, 12, 15% reduction in the budget without a lot of, everything's painful, but we can accommodate those things. But when you start talking 25, 35%, we started putting this together. That's why we kind of came to the conclusion of all of these items that we've highlighted here really ought to be on the table with some small exception. And we should be pursuing all of these, which gets us going for this next fiscal year. And then what we do is we get planning on these section E things what do those look like in the future, but that also becomes dependent upon, what does it look like in the fall or next spring as far as revenues.
I have just a comment looking at section C. I think the hiring freeze is something that we have to do in budget reduction 1. While people have been complaining about their level funded expense budgets, I don't think we have a choice, but I would not support level 2 and 3 in that item. I think that eliminating public safety training is just not a good choice. It's not smart. And I mean, I think eliminating or reducing public safety overtime also is, I mean, it looks good on paper, but the reality is it is what it is. And when the phone rings, they go. So I'm not sure exactly what we achieve by doing that. And again, with the human resource service funding, perhaps that piece of it, it could reduce a little bit, but times are really tough right now. And I think we have a need for it. So
One of the reasons for this sheet, and again, it's not exhaustive and it could be more detailed as we move through the process, but really, what's the number we're putting in here as far as revenue reductions? If the number is $6 million, for example, which is a high number, and the sum of all these adds up to, after you back out a couple things that you don't want to put in there, $6 million, then you're balanced. But if you can't come up with the 6 million in these items A through D, then what you're saying is you got to make up for it when we consider items in the category E. So if we don't come up with whatever our revenue reduction target is in these items A through D, we've got to come up with it through here.
We go back to section B. I still didn't get an answer to my question.
So this part, Norm?
Right. So what is the 578,000?
So those are other available funds, as you might recall from reading the motions in the past or being on the FinCom. Article 2, our operating budget is funded from a number of sources and a number of funds, like the ferry tax fund, the waterways protection fund, cemeteries funds. They all have these little things that have come in that are segregated by law for certain purposes. And we use them as funding sources each year. But what we would be doing this year is really maximizing those. If there's any available funds in those non-general fund accounts, we'd be utilizing them.
Okay. And then so how would I'm still puzzled by this maximized levy capacity. How would that be? How would that affect our tax rate? It's not the tax increase that's already occurred, or it's not. What you're saying is we'd have to go to the full 2.5% to support. Well, we'd have to go to the full 2.5%. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I just don't understand what that number is. If because
so all things being equal, the prior draft of the budget that we had been working with had unused levy capacity of $465,000. If you don't want to cut something further out of that budget, then you can either cut expenses or raise revenues. So and our revenues are local receipts, state receipts, and property taxes. So we could raise, I'm not suggesting this, but for example, you could raise property taxes even more, but you would require an override for any amount over about $465,000. And obviously we're not contemplating that, but you could do that. One of the things Ed could speak to, but I do want to point it out. If we're cutting our overlay from the 500,000 that typically that we appropriate to 200,000, that might leave us a little bit short. If a typical year can range anywhere between 300,000 and 400,000. But we have unspent overlays from prior years, and that's the balance of them. It can be used for deficits and abatements for any particular year. And if it's an excessive amount, it can also be used, if it's released by the assessors, it can also be used by town meetings similar to free cash. But we have an issue with that in that at the moment, we have a due date for our tax bills, which was extended to June 30th. And so we have significant unpaid tax bills at the moment. Most assessors will not, boards of assessors will not release overlays unless because they usually back out any receivables that are still outstanding or any potential appellate tax board cases. Usually we don't have a lot of those, but we certainly do have a lot of property tax receivables at the moment. We're hoping in the order of magnitude of about $6 million, and we're hoping that the majority of that will come in by the end of June. So I guess the overriding message here is not a lot of great choices, but as far as balancing the budget, it really is an unprecedented territory. 2010, we had a lot of pain associated with a 12% reduction in local receipts, and we're talking 25 to 35% to start for this fiscal year. And our suggestion, or at least what Ed and I discussed it, if you were to accommodate that or accomplish that, that the reserve funds and stabilization, capital stabilization, and free cash are there to backstop you if you need to make an adjustment this fall or next spring, or to carry this through an additional year, because it occurs more than one could potentially occur more than one fiscal year.
Ed, in terms of the
Yes, sir.
outstanding property taxes, I think you stated before that we're uncollected about $6.8 million.
That's correct.
And in terms of using stabilization funds, in lieu of, for example, raising the property taxes, how would that impact on the borrowing that we have coming up for DPW, the school, and the initial wastewater project?
Our stabilization and our free cash levels are two components that S&P looks at very closely, as well as various other factors. So if our fund balance becomes negative, or not negative, but reduces over time, they're going to potentially look to downgrade us from a AA plus, which is one notch from a AAA, potentially down to a AA. I don't know that would happen, but they've also downgraded the entire municipal sector. So we need to come out of this in fairly good shape as it relates to our various fund balances, and look to not touch things such as general stabilization unless that's absolutely necessary. I think we're fine with capital stabilization and utilizing that. So if, for example, we said that we're not going to use the monies that Rich outlined for the roadway projects, but say in November, when we have a better visibility into where we're going from an economic standpoint, we can always utilize the capital reserves to put back that roadway spending. And I think Rich alluded to the fact that we haven't completely spent down the roadway funding, and we have enough money with Chapter 90 to continue doing roadway projects well into November, when we can get that visibility, and we can look to utilize either free cash or capital stabilization for that roadway funding.
So is what you're saying is if we budget the 1.3 for capital roadway funds, you don't see that probably impacting the bond rating as you would say with general capitalization, general stabilization funds. But going forward, if you didn't need all of that money, that would be one of the places where you could still dedicate a portion of that money to have roadway work done in the next fiscal year.
Absolutely. And I would just say that, you know, if we took roadway capital funding off the table until, say, November, when again we have a clearer understanding of what the impacts are to the town, we have $500,000 of unspent roadway improvement funds right now, and we'll have hopefully a similar amount of Chapter 90 funding in next fiscal year. So we could carry ourselves, I believe, from a June through November timeframe doing road work, and then we can look to restore that in November at a town meeting. And then obviously when the local receipts start to rise again, then that the roadway funds would be put back into the levy as it was intended by the voters.
Let's explore that question a little bit, because what happens in years 2, 3, and 4 if the receipts don't recover? And then we've got to replace at some point, if not all, so a substantial amount of that roadway funding.
Well, let me give you a perspective of what most communities do as it relates to capital, and roadway funding would be one of them. Most communities utilize free cash and borrowing for their capital. Yarmouth is being very innovative by having that within its levy. So what we would have to do, I think as you might recall, we had $1.5 million within the levy for routine capital. We had a large bill we had to pay for the schools. We had to reduce that $1.5 million for that particular year, and then we built it back up. So those would be the priorities that the Board of Selectmen, I believe, would set to actually build that funding back up once local receipts or other factors help us to emerge so that we can actually restore that funding permanently within the levy.
Well,
And in the meantime,
but what you're saying is,
go ahead, Norm.
but what you're saying is that if any money that we utilize of that roadway funding, and let's say it's $1.5 million, if our receipts do not recover, then in order to get roadway funding built back up, we've got to increase taxes.
Yeah, if our receipts don't recover, if we're at a 30% reduction in where we were in 2019, we've got a lot of things to do. Not necessarily increase taxes. We may need to, as Rich indicated, that bottom of the list, we've got to look at that bottom of the list very carefully.
Right.
So it's up to the selectmen as to whether we would increase taxes or whether we would reduce services or programs.
Right. So for now, we've put what we think are, viable options for you to consider that don't impact significantly town operations. To the extent that you can't take action on some of these, to the extent you don't do some of these, that adds to the burden that we've got to cut down here. It's a balancing act. And it's also a timing exercise of how much time do you want to give yourself to do that? You know, if you tell us that all this has to happen by July 1, that's a difficult task. You know, could we do it? Yeah, we could do it. We'll make it work. But it won't be as clean as it would be if you have time to plan for how you might address some of these reductions in services. And so it's a balancing act and it's a timing consideration.
Rich, when are you looking for a decision on these items?
Well, we don't know when our town meeting is going to be yet, so I guess it's not imminent that we need to know tonight. But obviously, the more direction we have, the better. We can start planning accordingly. You know, there's a level of detail to each of these items that we can provide as we start digging into it. We just didn't want to provide a level of detail for every single item if there's some items that aren't going to happen. But ultimately, you need to pass a budget, and that articles that are presented at the upcoming town meeting need to be presented as such, or at least have an amended motion to adjust to that budget. So we need these relatively soon. So in the next couple of weeks, I think we need to finalize the approach here.
So we're looking at, in terms of the overall plan, to make up a budget deficit of approximately $6.8 million, correct?
Well, those options A through D presented $6.8 million of opportunity, which translates into about, would, you know, if you did, and if out of that 6.8 million, you ended up at 6 million, that's about you've covered yourself for about a 35% reduction, which, as Ed and I were going through this exercise, think that's warranted, with the proviso that you always reserve the right to revisit these in the fall and next spring. And that's where we would suggest that you utilize one-time sources if you thought it was important to continue these things at that time to accommodate those things.
So the real uncertainties are, we don't know where we're going to stand with the property taxes. Hopefully we'll get a good portion, if or all of that 6.8 million, but that remains to be seen. People don't have the money, we may not get it in. Then we have the meals taxes and motel taxes and motel occupancy taxes for short-term rentals, motels. I can't get too optimistic about those revenue sources, given the current state of things and the fact that everybody I talk to that rents property, you know, before the governor's regulations got too specific, were saying the calls they were getting were more for cancellations than they were for bookings. So I'm not so sure that we're going to get a lot of people that are going to be making last minute plans. I think the reduction in revenue could be worse than what we're planning for. I really don't think that 30-35% is aggressive.
And all that being said, not to add more to the plate here, but none of this contemplates yet any potential changes from our two major regional school districts, Cape Cod Tech and DY. All of this contemplates at the levels that had been previously provided to us, which might not be a safe bet either.
Well, we can only hope that the Cape Cod Municipal Health Plan will hold the rate again. That would be a huge help. That's helped us in the past. I'd like to look at those other, I don't know what your contemplations are, and I know it's a lot of time looking at all those other departments that you listed below, but I mean, I'd like to look at all the options before we make a decision. I know it's probably, like I said, a lot of time for you, but Some of those on the top, I'm not real comfortable with, not that I want to, probably going to be comfortable with any of them. And I know we have to make a decision, but it would be nice to have all of our options laid out, and make sure we pick the least impactful choices.
The only thing I hear what you're saying, and we can certainly give you some level of detail on what some of those reductions look like, what the impact to the budgets of each department are. We can project that and show that to you. But my caveat to all of this is that's a tendency basically to trim around the edges. And unfortunately, I feel like we're in the position that we got to trim around the edges, and we also have to cut off some of these edges and take some more drastic action that you might not be accustomed to, or your principled positions of how you think things ought to happen are well-founded, and then in many cases are reflected in our financial policies. But at what point do you move off those principled positions? Is there ever a point? And I'm not here to tell you what you should or you shouldn't, but that's the question in front of you is at what point do we abandon those to preserve something bigger than that?
Yeah, in terms of that last group, I gotta believe that looking at recreation programs and golf programs, that they're gonna suffer significantly too. For the same reasons that, any other tourist-related activities will be down. Restaurants, motels.
But shouldn't there be a coinciding savings to those downturn?
Not
Well, to some
necessarily.
degree, but with golf, as you know,
I mean, those are enterprise funds, so.
yeah, it's labor
Money's not
intensive.
there and you lay people off, it's not gonna really help the budget on an overall basis.
No, but it's gonna run a big deficit if we don't get play through it. And you still have to hire a fair amount of people to take care of that investment.
Well, golf will.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Getting
then we're
booked.
asking for $300,000 to plug the gap on this year's budget.
Yeah, I was speaking more of if you had an enterprise account, let's say for the summer at Flax Pond, and you didn't open it at all, you wouldn't have any staff, but you wouldn't have any revenue.
Right.
And I'm suggesting that would not help the budget at all.
No, because there's a little bit of I suppose,
It
a
would
surplus.
help you avoid losses perhaps, but that's about it.
But the other thing that drives into that too is just, what does the tourism economy look like? And will people even want to go on vacation and pay for daily beach passes and the things that they would normally do on top of the motel and meals tax receipts? Everything's going to take a hit across the board.
That's part B of the discussion, Dan, that people don't consider. They talk about the regulations and relaxing the regulations, and they're therefore assuming that that's going to result in revenues being at the levels they were before we had this COVID-19 crisis.
And part of,
to your point, now you got to look at the public and what their mentality is, and whether you want to invest in vacations the way they did in the past, when a lot of the amenities are not going to be available to them.
and back to my earlier point, as one of the reasons timing is important is, some of these activities likely aren't going to look the way they look today. And so when you talk about recreation programs and summer programs and beaches and lifeguards and all number of things, the way those operations have to be run might be quite different. And I don't know what that looks like at this point. We might know that better come the fall. Better spot to adjust accordingly at that point. But again, the timing of it's important too, because what you think you might traditionally do might not be how you approach it going forward. That's not an easy thing to contemplate, but.
Well, Mr. Chairman, may I say something?
You certainly may.
I feel like this is the second time we've seen this, and I don't want to see it again. I know we can keep kicking this can a week at a time until we run out of time. But, I think we need to take action. And I think that the outline that has been provided for us solves a very difficult problem. I'm not sure that there's anything in there that anyone would blame us for doing, given the circumstances. You know, I have been a watchdog for that roadway funding, but as Ed described it, you know, it might not be that bad. It might correct itself later. And I think that, you know, these are desperate times. And, you know, while we did say that they would never be used for anything other than roads, nobody could have anticipated a $6 million shortfall. So I don't object to that either. You know, the one thing I question is the usage of the excess levy capacity. But I do feel like that's with it, as long as that's within the 2.5%, we do have the ability to do that. So I guess that I would make a motion to adopt the budget cuts outlined in items A through D, at least for now. And if we find that we need to adjust at some point, we certainly can. But, you know, let's take some action and stop postponing this.
Okay, do I have a second on that motion?
I'll second that.
All right, Norm seconded.
Mark did.
You second my second?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know you did as well.
You've thirded it. Mark. Okay, so Norm's the second. Any further
I
discussion?
have one other question.
Yes, Norm.
You know, we're going to have golf on the agenda, and you know, we may want to talk about this further, but should we consider not opening one course, or perhaps not opening a course and a half, effectively closing the blue course and Bass River? Should we consider finding a way to do I don't know if we could, to do the infrastructure work for wastewater on Bass River immediately? And, you know, so we don't open it up for 6 months and we decide to keep it shut until the money's available to move forward with that work, or maybe that golf course or for recharge could be used first, as opposed to the other recharge locations that are being considered for the wastewater fund, you know, plan. You know, I think there might be some advantages in a lot of different ways to doing that now rather than later. It's just a thought, and I wanted to just put it on the table before we get into lengthy discussions about, you know, reopening golf.
Norm, those are good points, and a couple of comments that occur to me just sitting here at the moment. We'll start with the wastewater first. We do have suggested on the warrant that we move forward with some design and Route 28 construction money, because we want to position our wastewater project to be eligible if a stimulus package were to be passed, similar to the ERA funds back in 2008 or 9, which would then provide, you know, non-town funding of wastewater programs going forward. So, but that's, you know, unknown at this point. But also, and unknown at this point, but maybe within the next several months or up to a year, maybe we'll get some answers as to the Cape Cod Water Protection Trust and what that might be available and how does that line up with doing some work. But you're exactly right. If we would be down or operating at less than capacity, that would be the time to address, move forward and address that. At least start planning for addressing that wastewater need at a recharge site. I did talk with Scott, and I don't want to preempt the golf discussion. And Scott has a plan. But one of the things about, we still need to maintain, for example, the links course, but part of his plan is to increase the normal start time of 7.5 minutes per start at Bayberry and Bass River to an increase to a 15-minute start increment. And so one of the ways you can accommodate additional players in that scenario is by maintaining the links course being open. You know, some people go to the links and you get more play that way. So in any event, I don't want to preempt that discussion, but those have been considerations, and Scott and I have had those discussions, and I know he's had those discussions with Dan and Pat. And so I'll leave that for the golf discussion, I guess, but those are all good points.
Okay.
I would like to go back to the items I talked about and see. I'd like to know what the $150 when it says reductions of human services funding, public safety overtime, and further reductions to expense accounts. And specifically the next one, significant cuts to budgets, elimination of public safety training. What does that leave them with?
Well, on the human services side, that's the, I think the grant program's up to $60,000, so that would be gone.
So that's complete elimination.
Well, that's what we would propose,
Okay.
right? As far as, I think in the police budget, there's two different lines for overtime. One related to training overtime at $100,000 and one related to PAC overtime. I think that's at $100,000 as well. I share your reservation as it relates to that. I think that's not something that I'd have to check with the chief to see to what degree does the training activities are required. He talks constantly about the patrolman having to have so many X hours of annualized training. We'd have to further flesh that out. Is there some reduction maybe in overtime we could take? Well, maybe. We do have the indemnification account, I think has about maybe $125,000 or $135,000 in it still. That was the line of duty indemnification account that could be available to backstop us a little bit if we ran into some overtime problems there. But certainly we would give you at the next meeting a more thorough, detailed analysis if that's what you'd like.
Well, not if we're going to vote on it tonight. So I guess I need the information now. I personally would take those two items out. I mean, in the $6 million, are we making more cuts than, I know you said we could put them back in, but is 35%? I mean, before we were talking about the 4.3 million. That's where I thought we were trying to be at. Now we're going well beyond that. So when you say we can always add them back in, why is it that if we're short, we can't act upon it then?
Yeah, there's an approach to this. So the motion, it depends however the board members would like to word it. So we'll take your direction, but we're just looking at this point for some of the approach. And if the approach is address all those items A through D, those add up to 6.8 million.
Right. That was what the motion was, right, Eric?
Yes.
And we can give you the details on all of those, and perhaps when you finally vote this, you might vote something less than 6.8 million. But we'd outline all those exact decisions, and maybe, just for sake of argument, maybe out of that 6.8 million, we ultimately end up voting on items that provide for $6 million. We certainly didn't come with the level of detail on every single item tonight. We weren't prepared to get into that level of discussion. We wanted to give it to you in a manageable fashion. But the direction I would take this is, what does implementing all these look like? And we can get you that detail. And for example, and I'll just use the roadways since that's the item of discussion, is maybe we do cut the routine capital of 1.5, for example, altogether, but maybe we leave roadways in the budget and just defer it or freeze it. And so it's already there, but we know it's not going to be spent. And if it can be spent, then it would be spent. And so there's a different way, there's a few different ways to approach things. You can approach them through saving the money through a freeze, or you can save the money by cutting them outright. And so we could do a combination of all that.
If we reduce these from the budget, we can't spend them. So that would be the advantage of leaving it and then making those freezes as needed. I mean, I think it's extremely aggressive to go with 6 million complete cut from the budget from the beginning. I think that we probably a plan about a 4.3 was what I was looking at, so I didn't think we had to do this entire slate. But I'd be more comfortable leaving this budget and putting freezes on items so that way we can take more of a wait and see approach without having to call a town meeting. Because if we turn around and find out that we're not that short, we can't just turn around and say, okay, well, we'll put it back in now without going and getting it appropriated.
I don't recall the exact motion of Selectman Tully, but so Eric, I apologize if I got this wrong, but I don't know that we didn't provide you the level of detail on all these items. So I kind of took it as you want us to address this slate of $6.8 million worth of items, and we would come back to you with the details and what that looks like and how you might implement it, knowing your sensitivities to some of these items. And so that would involve a variety of cuts and freezes on other items, for example, on the roadways. But we would address all the $6.8 million of items on this slate that was presented to you in one form or fashion.
I thought his motion was.
And this is Ed Sentio. I just wanted to add that we already have now a fall town meeting. So within a matter of months from what happens in July, you could, for example, restore the roadway funding from the capital stabilization because that's an available fund. Free cash could be used to put back any of the spending that was not appropriated for July. So there is already a mechanism both in November and in May to actually address anything that might be removed for the July town meeting or for the June town meeting, hopefully.
I think for us particularly, it's that receipts number that we have to work towards. You know, one of the things, if you think about the last downturn being at like 10.5 to 11% off on receipts, think right now there's nobody in any hotels, nobody in any short terms, nobody in restaurants. There's almost virtually no tax generation occurring. And then Mark Grills told me today that it looks like permits, even though we're active, it's about 2/3 of what it would normally be in this particular period in the spring. So work is significantly off. So that all being said, over the summer, personally, going into this, it's almost like day by day, you get more pessimistic as to what that future looks like. Where maybe I was more comfortable like 2 weeks ago at 25% reduction, I'm actually more comfortable at saying it's going to be like 30 or 35%, because even like the messaging that we got from the Lieutenant Governor today was the switch doesn't come on magically on the 18th. It's going to be a slow, deliberate rollout linked to testing data from, decline in hospitalizations, decline in test positives, and that's going to be different everywhere else. But the biggest thing that's really working against us is people I don't think are going to want to come out and go on vacation and be around fellow human beings to any great extent, particularly in the demographic that spends a lot of their time here on the Cape in the summertime. And when you think about what I think when we close this quarter on the sales tax situation, we'll have a good glimpse into what the future sales and meals tax is going to look like. I mean, this is, we would normally be approaching the best time here, May, June, July, August, September, where you hit the ball out of the park, and that's just not even going to happen. We might not even get it out of the infield this year. So I think the deeper you go initially and give us that targeted percent reduction in receipts, we can work towards that. And you know what? As we get data coming in from sales and meals tax, if it's better than that, then we can work towards that. But to undershoot it now would be real problematic.
Well, like I said, we're going back to town meeting, as Ed said, in November. So, I mean, we could make adjustments either way.
We really need to have a number that the board has agreed upon so that we can work towards that and provide you that level of detail you need to be comfortable on any of these votes. That's really the key, is what revenue projection number are we looking at?
Okay.
Not tonight. You don't need to do that tonight, but for.
Well, we have a motion and a second on the table. I'm going to call for a vote. Norm?
Aye.
Eric,
Aye.
Mark,
Aye.
I vote aye. Tracy,
Nay, I'm not prepared at this time. I don't think we have the information that we need to make that vote.
okay, so that the motion passes by a vote of 4-1.
Okay, we'll provide more level of detail as you requested for the next meeting next week.
That's not what the motion was.
No, I understand that, but we will provide that for you so you understand what those impacts are.
Kind of funny that we understand the impacts after the vote.
Well, this is where we're trying to, this is a more macro view of the budget, and we can get into the nitty gritty. But we needed to have a planning number as to what percentage that we need to look at. Otherwise, we just keep doing the same thing meeting after meeting.
All right, next item, annual town election update, possible vote.
Yep, so I've asked Phil Gaudette to join us. He sent the memo along with that. I think, I don't see the squares here, but I think he's still with us.
I'm here. So we're set for a June 30th election. Very good news. Mid-Tech, Cape and Islands Association of Realtors, they are available. And although my memo says that we may need to use porta-johns for election staff, the Cape and Islands Association of Realtors has indicated that's one of the first things they're going to work on. So, so it's highly likely that we will, it will be all functioning. So we are ready for the June 30th election.
Okay. How about the special election?
Special election, we're prepared for that as well. And as the memo indicates, it would be a dual election, which the town has had before back in 2018. So it will be in conjunction on September 1st with the state primary.
Okay, but we'll have two different ballots, right?
Two different ballots, correct.
All right, so you need a vote of the board on both of those items.
Correct.
Okay, so the annual town election is going to be set at June 30. Do I have a motion to that effect?
So moved.
Second.
Okay. Call for a vote. Norm?
Aye.
Tracy?
Aye.
Mark?
Aye.
Eric?
Aye.
I vote aye as well, so that passes unanimously. Can I have a motion to have the special election for a vacated selectman seat to be held contemporaneously with the state primary election on September 1st?
So moved.
Have a second?
Second.
Okay. All those in favor? Norm?
Aye.
Tracy?
Aye.
Mark?
Aye.
Eric?
Aye.
I vote aye as well. It passes unanimously. Next item is regional guidance to seasonal residents / visitors, possible vote.
So that was sent to you. It was not in the packet. It was sent to you under separate cover, as mentioned to you, that it was presented to the town administrators and managers that if they could present this to their boards and get a possible vote of support, they would add that to the communication that could then be provided to different tourism groups or to your own website, for instance. It's all stuff that you've seen before by now, for sure. So
I think that's the exact point. This goes back to the same thing with the multiple levels of people and rules. This has all been established. These are the same rules that Governor Baker put into place. What is the significance of our vote? It's meaningless.
I think it's just in this particular case, it was a action by the parties that you see that have signed on to this, that we all speak to the visitors uniformly. I don't think, for matter of form, it doesn't mean a whole bunch of anything. It just was more a matter of, hey, to the town leadership, this is what we're doing. If you can get a vote to sign on to it, that's great. but no harm done if you don't, so.
I agree with Tracy. It's seems like old news, really, more of the same. I don't think it adds anything to what we and probably the public already knows, but I'd like to hear from the other board members on that.
Dan, when was that sent?
I think I sent it to you last Friday. It's updated May 1st. So when I got the updated version of it, I sent it over to you.
So this would go out from the state?
Well, this would be like an official communication as it relates to anybody that was looking to come to the Capes. You know, again, this is more symbolism than it means anything of any substance.
I mean, how is this going to, they're going to broadcast it?
Yeah, that would be the plan. That was my understanding, is this would be shared with particularly those folks from, you know, the traveling public that want to come to the Cape, that this would be our statement officially from those folks that live here to the people coming to visit us.
Yeah, I don't know. I just, you know, I have the feeling that, you know, people, when they're calling for reservations, they're going to have some sort of discussion with the hotel or motel that they want to come to, or, you know, private home, whatever the case may be. You know, I mean, that's where the communication is going to take place. To me, broadcasting something out on the airwaves or throwing an article in the newspaper is frankly BS. It just, you know, I don't know who it's satisfying, and I think it creates an even worse view of the Cape that we don't really need at this point. I think it'd be better having, if we have guidelines that are going to change for hotels and motels, then that's published to them. That's part of the state promulgation of policy with regard to this thing. And then it's up to the hotels and motels to inform their potential guests. You know, I just
Nobody that reads this is going to come here. So this is a stay away notice.
yeah, and that's the way I feel too. You know, it's like slapping people in the face.
I don't disagree with any of that. I think to some degree that there was a certain nervousness, particularly in some communities more than others, associated with the summer tourist season coming up. And I think that's the genesis of it. I think you're all correct on that. Like I said, it doesn't, they just asked to present it to your boards at the next possible opportunity. And if you voted to support it, then I don't think by not voting, it doesn't mean anything, you know, because it's going to go out one way or the other. Somehow it made it to the public before we even had a chance to show it to you.
It's already been in the newspaper.
That's what I mean. I don't think it was supposed to go out that quick.
The governor already told people when you travel here, you have to quarantine for 14 days. You have to bring your own groceries. It's the same thing.
Right.
I make a motion to take no action on this guidance to Cape and Island seasonal community.
I second that. I don't think there's anything in it for us to endorse this. I think Tracy said it well, that it's nothing new. It's old news. As Eric has said, and Norm has concurred, it's a stay away notice to people. I don't see anything beneficial about it.
Dan, I got a quick question for you. It's your understanding that this has already gone out, right?
Well, it was my understanding that we were asked to share it with the boards to get a vote of support one way or the other, to give them a chance to weigh in on it. Before I knew it, there was this latest iteration that came out, and then it went to the papers. And I think there was a fair amount of miscommunication on that front. I was under the impression that nobody was going to see it till it was publicly brought in front of the boards across the Cape.
I see, but it looks like that plan has sort of,
Yeah, it's completely unraveled. That's correct.
right,
Yeah.
right. So, I mean, I can understand the need to endorse something before it goes out, but this is already out. So I think Eric's motion is understandable. At this point, it's already out there. I don't think our action one way or the other really means anything.
I agree.
Should we just leave it alone? Let it die on the
Well, you could. I
vine?
mean, I don't think it matters
Yeah.
one way or the other. Yeah.
I would offer that.
Let's just bypass it entirely.
Okay.
Okay, brings us to review and approve the 2020 ATM warrant. Dan, you have some.
Yeah, I have
news
some
after
information for you.
consulting with Town council on that.
Yeah, so I spoke to council, so although there's a little bit of a wrinkle today on that I'll share with you. So anything that's in your domain is in your authority to pull from the final warrant that gets presented. We never actually published it, so it hasn't really been officially seen in public yet. However, the 3 citizen petitions have to stay on there. Although all three of those groups have told us that they are fine with moving those to the fall. Because they met the requirement to appear on the ballot in the time frame back in early January, they have to appear.
Right.
Now, secondly to that, the Community Preservation Committee met and they've voted to have all of their articles appear on the warrant. So I believe, and Rich, I'm not sure if you had a chance to check it, but there was a piece of legislation that was working through today on the Senate side that would give special authorizations to Board of Selectmen about streamlining what can appear on these warrants. Because this is a statewide conversation amongst towns about town meeting, how it can be conducted, and what authority does a Board of Selectmen have associated with putting only necessary financial articles in front of the public. So last I had seen earlier today that legislation was under consideration. Rich, you heard something different that it might have gone through?
I understand it passed this afternoon. I just got a brief on it. I haven't really had a chance to look at it. And I think it does provide for the boards of selectmen to direct that process. But we'll probably got to run it through Jay and town council in our, just to validate that. And I did get a memo from the CPC that once I review that, I can forward that along as well. So we, they have some reasons why they thought it was important. So we'll forward that to you for your consideration, as well as the impact of the new legislation as to whether or not it allows you to include it or not. So.
My position is we should only put on the spring warrant, or now it's probably the summer warrant, what we have to deal with, and then defer everything else to the fall meeting. Notwithstanding any other committee's vote.
We can't add to it.
I think we should do.
Right. We'll get some.
I have the memo from the CPC. If you'd like to hear, there are 3 reasons for keeping all of their articles on. I can read them.
Why don't you recite that, please?
Number 1, I'll read the paragraph. After thoughtful discussion, the CPC voted to keep all articles on the warrant. The reasoning behind the position is the articles are, number 1, essential to town operations. The housekeeping article provides administrative funding. Number 2, essential to providing funding that will help meet community housing needs likely exacerbated by the COVID-19. And number 3, construction-related historic and recreation articles will involve or set the stage for construction, which will provide economic stimulus to the local economy. Those are the 3 reasons for voting to keep the CPA articles on the ATM warrant. There's some more about funding and affordable housing trust requests, but those aren't. I don't think those are germane to the articles.
So we're gonna bring this back to the next meeting, are we? With,
Yeah, so what we'll do is we'll
an
add,
update on the legislative action and see if the town council has any, anything we can provide.
yeah, and we'll present to you a draft with all the things that we think need to be on it.
Okay, good. I think that's all we can do with the current moment.
Has there
Let's
been,
go,
can I ask a question, Mike?
go ahead.
Has there been any further guidance on other ways to conduct annual town meeting?
Well, so there's some conversation going on in that Senate bill, and I got it, like I said, it was in draft form that I read it today. A Zoom meeting, for instance, it would only be eligible if you had representative town meeting.
Okay, that makes
Okay,
sense.
that's what it read in the legislation. The other one related to a quorum. If you had a quorum set, the legislation would allow you to push the town meeting such that only 10% of your quorum would need to be met. Now, we don't have a quorum. We have a quorum of 0. So if 10 people showed up, you can have your town meeting. But as far as like how, the ballot was kind of universally rejected as it did not allow an opportunity for people to have debate on individual items. So that didn't seem to get any traction. So I think we're at a position now where do we want to move it to a later date, or if we go ahead with it, how is it that we can do it and maybe 85 people show up and we space them all out, something along that line. I think in the next couple of weeks, particularly when the next round of guidance comes out from the governor's office, you'll see if there's a serious restriction on bringing human beings together, you're going to see more and more towns move it to the fall to a safer time. I just don't know what that looks like right now. I do know there are a number of towns already making that move to just move it to the fall and then operate off a 1/12 budget from this year's appropriation.
I hear your explanation, but I don't think things will be better in the fall in terms of
It'd be true, Norm.
group gatherings. Until we have an immunization, people are not going to trust anything, any major group gatherings. And hell, you get 250 65 plus year old people in a room, for town meeting, and then another 100 of those people attending are under 65. Well, geez, really? It's just not going to happen.
No, I agree with you, and I don't know if you can officially limit participation. So even if you had, like I said, we don't have 0, but I think you got to let anybody in that's a resident, that's a registered voter. That's so you can't really even say just 50, the first 50 that show up. I don't think you can even do that.
Right.
I doubt you could do that.
One of the things I asked Dennis, I had heard that perhaps Dennis was looking at a tent, a rather large tent and they're the day after hours, and it's an exterior event. So I'm trying to find out whether or not, if that's a serious rumor that was going through Dennis, if that was the case, we could share the expense potentially if it was put up at DY. And then maybe perhaps, again, it all comes back down to what would be allowed with the total number of people to come together. But maybe it could accommodate 200 people. I don't know, but it's something.
Unfortunately, I've been at those tent meetings, and they are not spaced out 6 feet apart. I can guarantee you that much. The chairs are pretty close proximity to each other. There's probably accommodate a few hundred people.
Yeah.
So
the good news is we don't need to make a decision tonight on for sure, but I think, like I said, within 10 days, we're going to know a lot more about what our options are.
Maybe we could have it on the golf course.
Only if it doesn't rain, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna have to get some more current information on that. Okay, golf opening discussion.
Yeah, so I sent, I have Scott Gilmore on the meeting here, and town council's also joined us. So we sent an updated document to you today from Scott related to potentially opening golf at whatever date that you choose to. There was some commentary that Scott received from potentially from Mass Golf that talked about maybe there's a chance that the governor will loosen the grip on golf prior to the 18th deadline. So Scott, maybe you have more detail on that?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Yeah, there's was an email that got sent out today that there's serious communication going back and forth to try to lift this as quick as possible. We're just awaiting final word if we're going to get that restriction lifted as early as this weekend, but nothing is official yet. We're still in kind of the hold pattern.
So we did prepare what work operations would look like if we decided to, if you decided to have us open it up. I mean, Scott, where did you get the work recommendations from?
Yeah, it's everything that was sent is based on Mass Golf Association's recommendations to the state, as well as New England PGA, USGA, and numerous other states' protocols that they put in place to run during COVID or post COVID-19, if you will, to keep all those are in the same protocols we have ready to go for whenever that restriction does get lifted.
So the question tonight is why would we wait? Why can we not be in charge of our own destiny and open our golf courses and abide by these guidelines, which have obviously been prepared in preparation for future opening at some point? Why can't we what's preventing us from just doing it? And I mean, what would be the consequences, Dan?
Well, that's why I asked Jay to be on the phone. I was reminded also too today that not only was there a governor's order to not, that it's not essential, there was also a Yarmouth Board of Health order that it be closed too. So I would rather have Jay speak to the legal pitfalls associated with that decision making.
Jay, let's start with can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, let's start with Eric's first question, and that is at the state level with these restrictions, and I don't know if you've had an opportunity to see them, but they seem to address just about everything Governor Baker talked about and more. Why can't the town go ahead and open its golf course with those restrictions?
Well, there's the practical and there's the legal, Mike. And, this might fit in the category of, if you don't want a legal answer, don't ask a lawyer a question. So from a strictly legal perspective, in the governor's eyes, although I see some ambiguity in the original order, the governor has interpreted his order as not allowing golf. So the full range of potential enforcement lies. That initial round of enforcement, as I've discussed with Dan and put in writing a little bit in some emails, is local. The tools for the Board of Health are limited, especially if the entity that controls litigation isn't willing to provide those tools. So potentially there is some lack of teeth to local enforcement. The local Board of Health agent, though, can avail himself of the assistance of the local police, potentially the state police, and then from there it goes to the state, and the state has the full authority to enforce as well. Embedded within the governor's order is that no local rule that contradicts the state rule is enforceable or legal. Again, I don't know if in fact there's about a week left or so of a prohibition, how much zeal there's going to be for any enforcement. But my guess also is that Mass Golf is probably asking all of its various members to be patient because they don't want anyone to maybe erode the goodwill that they've built up at the governor's office. So that's where we're at now. There is potential enforcement. How real it is, I can't sit here and tell you that.
Well, I guess my first question is, what in the governor's regulations would prohibit Yarmouth Golf from opening its golf courses with all of those restrictions that are mentioned in the letter that Scott Gilmore, the memo he wrote to Dan Knappich?
The restrictions are great. Don't get me wrong, Mike. I think as someone who golfs, I think that there's a lot of common sense to those restrictions, or even a stricter level of restrictions if that's what the governor wants to do. We just don't get there because there's a prohibition right now. So that's the way the governor interprets it. Again, I've read that order a bunch of times, and I think there was some misinformation coming out of the gate with the order. It's hard to read it as strictly prohibiting golf, but the governor has issued several levels of guidance after that and said that they interpret it as prohibiting golf as being a non-essential item.
You talking about the March 24th order?
Yeah, the original order, yeah, the essential
Because there's
services.
nothing in that order that specifically mentions golf that I could see.
No, but it does talk about a list of essential services, and then there's a guidance and an FAQ regarding the interpretation of that list. I could see, if it was just the list, I could see some wiggle room from a legal argument standpoint, Mike, and I'd love to discuss it with you because I think it's an interesting academic argument. Somewhat irrelevant because the governor interprets it as prohibiting golf. So that's the guidance he's given, and that would be the direction he would give if he wanted to enforce against a community.
Okay, because it says, and again, I'm not going to go on and on, but it says this order does not prohibit gatherings of more than 10 people in an unenclosed outdoor space such as a park, athletic field, or parking lot. Athletic and recreational activities that bring participants into close physical contact are prohibited.
That's exactly the language. Yeah.
Close physical contact, but I think with those stipulations that Scott has in his memo, I don't think you're going to bring people within in close physical contact.
I think they also view it in terms of essential and non-essential on their basic terms too, Mike. So listen, don't get me wrong. That language that you read is exactly the language that I had when I was contemplating, would we have an argument on base statutory construction grounds, which is an important grounds. So if we were having an academic argument or even a legal argument with the governor, that's exactly the language I would cite. But for the purpose of resolving this short of court, in other words, challenging an order or directive of the state or any local authority to our opening of golf, we don't get there. We can't have that argument in the blind. There's no controversy that I could bring to the court right now over that particular question. I don't know how much with a week or so left in the potential enforcement they're going to fight for this, but I also know that Mass Golf is saying, give us, be patient. We think we can get where you want to go in a week's time, more or less.
Yeah, I could see the prohibition, assuming people were just allowed to come to the golf course as they have in the past prior to the governor's order and just do whatever they wanted to do, ride in golf carts together, have a 4 more people in a group that are all walking within a foot or two of each other, ball washers, reaching into the cup to get your ball out, all of which has been addressed in Scott's memo, then I could understand it, but I don't think the governor could do a better job in terms of regulating golf than what is reflected in Scott Gilmore's memo. But I have another question for you. Suppose that the town just opened the golf courses to its members only, not to the public. What do you think about that?
I think the prior question and answer to the argument under the prior question is more persuasive than that. Because I don't see a dividing line there for members or non-members. I think it might potentially blunt an all-out assault should the state want to do it for a brief moment. I think one potential argument for this, and again, it's not really a legal argument, it's more of a strategy argument, is let's say you open now and they lift the order in a week's time. As you know, Mike, we wouldn't get through the front door in a legal proceeding by the time it came around. But what I also don't want to do is put the golf course in a situation of falling out of favor with any of the regulatory authorities or their associations that they deal with for going too early either. Again, those are policy questions that the board's gonna have to decide on their own. My only point, again, is, as a lawyer, I think you could drive a truck through the definition, through the holes in the definition of what's essential and non-essential in the governor's order. But if the governor ends up getting hell-bent on enforcing against golf, or some local police officer or state police officer or state Department of Public Health official wants to get ornery, then we might be in that fight in the meantime.
On that issue about differentiating between essential and non-essential services, if I were to be involved in a case against the Commonwealth, I would be arguing about liquor stores over and over and over again as being essential. How rational is that?
That's
if you're an alcoholic, it's essential.
Well, that's the argument that the recreational dispensaries, recreational marijuana dispensaries said to when they were arguing this exact question on to the governor, and the judge even said, look, your distinctions between liquor stores and marijuana shops barely passes the straight face test, but it passes the straight face test. So,
you know, from an addiction point of view, I think the rationale behind that is the withdrawal of alcohol from somebody who has an addiction to it would overload our healthcare system when it should not be. That's the rationale behind it. We have a lot of people addicted to alcohol, and it's a true withdrawal that would need medical attention, and that's what I think that they were trying to avoid.
I've heard that argument too. I mean, again, it's not whether an argument makes good, clean sense. It's whether or not a judge is going to uphold it as passing a straight face test.
If that were the case, they could let him in with a prescription.
Yeah, but you don't have the same withdrawal from marijuana that you do with alcohol.
Or golf, somewhat addictive, I guess. All I know, Mike, to the point is that the governor, the court ultimately in the marijuana case said, regardless of the facial validity of any contrary argument, all the governor has to do is get over a very low hurdle for his rationale. It doesn't have to be even a prevalent view. It just has to be a reasonable person view that passes any smell test.
Okay. Does anybody have any comments on the discussion thus far, or any questions they would like to ask town council?
One question, Jay, that I have is, when I read the governor's order, there's some aspect of it that almost puts the Board of Health in a position where they play a role, or they have the authority, or they're directed in some way?
Not
Maybe you could help.
almost, it definitely does.
Right, so they have to play a role in enforcing the governor's orders. So in some sense, if we were to take action, the Board of Health is almost forced, their hands almost forced. Is that a fair way to characterize
Well,
it, or is that?
yes and no. So the enforcement is always discretionary, so they have the authority to enforce. They're not required to enforce. They're their first line of defense. If they chose not to enforce, the order preserves the right for the Department of Public Health or even the state police to enforce as well. So those things exist out there. But yeah, the Board of Health has the authority. They can't be mandated to enforce. They would have to essentially be sued in an act of mandamus, but the cases are legion that stand for the proposition that while enforcement is available, you can't force a town to expend its resources in the enforcement. So to the extent that Bruce and his board didn't want to enforce, it's likely it would fall through a few gaps before the state maybe got wind of it. And then it's up to them if they wanted to enforce.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that.
If you play that scenario out, if I were to say it out loud, I think we would all agree how ridiculous it is.
I'm sorry, Eric, what were you saying? How ridiculous what is?
Somebody's got on in the background.
If you were to play out the scenario of the town opening the golf courses,
right,
and then the health agents to essentially call the police to enforce what's the enforcement mechanism, that the golf courses are non-essential?
Well, there would be two, Eric. The first, that it would be non-essential, and the second, it would be a violation of the Board of Health's order under Chapter 111.
So you're talking about, just so for Eric's benefit, so you're talking two things. You're saying it would be a violation at the state level, and then you're saying it would be a violation of Chapter 111 on the local level, insofar as the Board of Health is concerned. Is that what you're saying?
It is a violation under both. Look, again, the straight legal view of this in terms of how the state is interpreting their executive orders, that opening the golf course would violate the governor's executive order, and it appears to violate on its face the local Board of Health's order as well.
Okay, I want to talk about the second part of what you just said. Koppelman put out an advisory to its clients, and they've taken the opposite position.
How so?
They've said that they quote Chapter 111, Section 104, and they say that, the Board of Health can close a facility when there's reasonable grounds to believe that the closure will prevent the spread of infection. And it says, therefore, when a Board of Health, together with the Board of Selectmen or other chief executive officer, has reasonable grounds to believe that the closure of a public place or gathering is necessary to prevent the spread of disease, it appears that it may order such under this statutory grant of authority. Then they go further to say, it should be noted that unlike other sources of the local Board of Health's authority, orders issued pursuant to generalized Chapter 111, Section 104 must also be approved by the Board of Selectmen or other chief executive officer of the municipality. The concurrence of the chief executive officer may be particularly important when considering the closure of officially sanctioned events, meetings of public bodies, or places where government services are provided. So they believe, as I always have, that under 111, Section 104, concurrence of the Board of Selectmen is crucial.
And that mirrors actually the first part of the my opinion on the beaches when we talked about that. that the requirement, first of all, I don't read 104 as to having any enforcement authority. It's more of a notice provision. I know it won't shock anyone to find me disagreeing with Kopelman and Page, but 104, the enforcement doesn't lie under 104. As I said in my prior opinion on the beaches, which would apply equally to golf, if they want to, the Board of Health, certainly under 104, is encouraged to work with the Board of Selectmen in terms of providing notice to the public of potential sources of filth or sickness or illness in publicly owned properties. However, the Board of Health has enforcement authority under sections 122 through 124, independent of the Board of Selectmen, or partially independent of the Board of Selectmen, in that they can issue orders to close certain facilities or to otherwise remove a situation that's the cause of sickness or health. Now, that's absent from the Kopelman opinion, but it's clear in that particular statute. If they do that, they would have to serve. They would have to serve a notice.
Don't they have to have very clear evidence?
They have to have what I would say would be substantial evidence, Norm, that would be essentially that a reasonable person could rely on. And in the instances of the beaches, as I mentioned previously, that might be a tall order if we weren't in the middle of a pandemic, but in the given the circumstances, the judges are probably likely to support boards of health. But there's a step in between there that I think is worth talking about, and that is that although the Board of Health has the authority to issue an order and then serve a notice upon the golf courses under section 124 that the golf course has to close, the Board of Health would then, if the golf course refused, has zero authority to go to court on their own, because that authority to approve a legal action lies with the Board of Selectmen, as does access to counsel.
So it's a moot point.
I'm sorry?
So it's a moot point, from the standpoint, sure, they can issue the order but they can't enforce it. So what's the difference?
Well, again, you're correct. They would need a mechanism to enforce it. It's difficult to come up with that unless, in fact, they had the support of state actors under the companion provisions of the executive order. And again, I don't know how much in what could be the governor's last weekend of enforcing against golf, how much resources they're going to pile into opening up Yarmouth's municipal golf courses. But I can't sit here and tell you that they don't have that authority. There could be a ring of state cops down at the golf course in the parking lot overnight and making everyone go home.
Any publicity is good publicity.
No.
I don't know. I've always scheme just for the heck of it.
Those statutes, Mike.
If a disease dangerous to the public health exists in a town, the selectmen and Board of Health, that's pretty clear. It's a conjunctive sentence.
Well, keep reading.
Shall use all possible care to prevent the spread of the infection and may give public notice of infected places by such means as, in quote, their, close quote, judgment, plural, may be most effectual for the common safety.
I don't think that provision, though, can be read to the exclusion of the provisions of section 122 through 124. I mean, that's been my opinion, basically.
No, I think you have to read any statute in its entirety, clearly.
Right.
But I think the converse of what you say is also true. I don't think you can read the previous sections to the exclusion of section 104.
Yeah. I mean, I don't disagree. These are confusing things. I also think that the whole health statute, chapter 111, technically really wasn't written for these types of purposes, but it's been morphed over time and the courts have expanded its reach. Look, Mike, you and I love having these discussions, and I would love nothing more than to have an hour and a half long discussion over the mundane points of chapter 111. To me, it's fascinating that we find ourselves basing an entire enforcement statewide under statutes that were never intended for it and trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. That's where we are. Lawyers might enjoy having that debate. It doesn't help you all in your ultimate decision on whether or not you want to defy what the governor feels is a pretty firm order.
Well, wait a minute. I'm not willing to say that if the town opened the golf course, they would be in defiance of the governor's order. I mean, you yourself said that it's not really clear.
The governor's interpretation of his own order is that golf is prohibited. Governor would control enforcement to the extent that he wants to make that argument. Don't forget, Mike, he's going to get deference in the interpretation of his own emergency order as well. So an argument I would love to have, don't get me wrong, you and I are reading it the same way, Mike. And I think everyone else here is too, that there's holes through this thing. I'd leave it to you whether or not, I love having these fights. So
no, I think it's important because I think the board may, and I'm not going to speak for the other board members, but they may make a decision as to opening the golf course on golf courses on some basis. And if they do, I think these legal issues are very important to them in terms of how they may decide to go forward or not to go forward.
I agree. I'm not trying to sweep anything under the rug. In fact, I think it's noteworthy that if someone challenged us on this and we wanted to defy it, there's a legitimate legal basis to at least get it before a judge as to what it is or what it isn't. Don't forget, there's always the argument that the governor's order isn't enforceable just because it simply doesn't make any sense. And in terms of disparate treatment, which is essentially the kind of argument and injunction the marijuana shops were seeking too. Ultimately, they weren't particularly successful, but the judge did somewhat chastise the governor and suggest he could have done a bit better in spelling this stuff out.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments of on the statute, the lines of authority, whether it be at the state or local level?
Other than going round and round and round? I mean, we're
Yes,
round and round and round.
Other than that.
Other than that.
You know, I'll bring up one point is Norm brought up the point of evidence, and I cannot find any evidence that supports the theory that the disease is, the spread of the disease is made more possible by people in small gatherings and outdoor venues. The evidence, you know, all the research I've done is quite to the contrary. You know, as long as people maintain social distancing, which they certainly can on a golf course or in a park or on a beach, you know, the health benefits far outweigh any potential risks. And there was specific language that you read, Mike, about the ability of the Board of Health to close to prevent the spread of the disease.
Correct.
There's no evidence to support that the disease is spread. People engaging in activities that are inherently distant from other people in the outdoors.
Well, we're not all 4 feet from the pin at all on all holes, Eric.
Well, I spend most of my time in the woods anyway, so I'm often alone.
So let's just say that we open the golf course and me and my buddies go out to play in accordance with the rules. And a state cop shows up and arrests us, if that's the enforcement. What is the town going to do when I sue for infringement of my rights?
Sue the town?
Sue the town?
I don't see much of a suit there. don't forget that the state police would probably disperse the golfers, but then there's also the accountability of the town and the golf course from the state enforcement too. My guess is most golfers, if told by a state police officer to move along, they probably would. There might be some outliers that don't, but by and large, they likely move along. If the state police say that's the max of what we're going to do, we're not going to harass the town of Yarmouth, then maybe it's not the worst thing in the world. That would be the worst that could happen. So, but that's only one possible area of enforcement.
I don't know. At some point, I got to believe that people are going to get fed up being kicked off their beaches, getting kicked out of their parks here in this town, and are going to say enough is enough. And I thought we had gotten that message across to Dan. Apparently not.
Difficult issues for sure.
Scott, I think you said that Bayberry would be ready to be open this weekend, but Bass River would not. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we just at this point didn't have enough staff, and I talked to Dan this morning. We've kind of geared up getting some seasonals ready, but at this point, even if you were to pull the trigger and open the golf courses, we just cannot accept golfers out there right now. I mean, we were in a kind of like putting the grass to sleep to do bare minimum here for a while, and now we're kind of ramping up along with what we've seen from Mass Golf and trying to get this lifted. So we only have enough staff to kind of get Bayberry ready at this point, and we're shooting for this weekend, hoping that the governor does lift the ban and we can get that golf course open.
So you would be ready to open Bayberry as early as this weekend?
Correct, yes.
Yeah, but not, how long would it take you to get Bass River open?
About a week or so, a little less depending on staffing levels, but I mean, we can pull it together pretty quickly, another couple of days, and we can get that one open up. So, to like Norm's point earlier that I was watching, the rules that are in place to make golf safe in this COVID world is effectively we lost half our tee times in every day. So closing a golf course would very much limit us in the amount of people we could put out when we're already losing half the capacity to the golf course. So the prepared plan that we have in place is for all operations to be running both golf courses, including links, knowing that we probably have pretty high capacity, knowing that we can only go 15 minutes instead of 8. But I would say that the whole underlying thing is to go against the governor here would be we would lose our standing with Mass Golf and other associations because we'd be pretty much on an island by ourselves. So the favorable with them and the tournaments they bring to us and the goodwill we get would go away. And that's pretty much what you're looking at here. Not to mention the press, possibly the bad publicity coming our way. So.
Scott, let me just add a question on to that. You said that in your discussions with the Mass Golf folks, were they reasonably optimistic? Is that how you characterized it? Or they were feeling somewhat hopeful that the governor, that we'd see some change? How would you characterize the talks?
Yeah, so I got an email today saying that they had very good conversation over the weekend and they're continuing the dialogue to try to get golf open as quick as possible. And the one I had today was trying to get it ready to go for this weekend. That's when I went to Dan saying we got to at least start the ramp up process to get a golf course ready to go in case that does happen.
So your contacts there were indicating that the advisory board and the governor may be even close to giving the green light on some golf activity even by this weekend?
Yeah, that's what we're getting from Mass Golf at this
Oh,
point.
that's
Now, it might not happen, but that's what we've gotten from them, and that they're working hand in hand right now, trying to work something out to get golf to come back. I don't know if Jay's heard anything on his front on that side, but they're doing, there's multiple people, Mass Golf, a lot of other alliances in the golf industry trying to get the governor to lift the restriction.
Thank you.
I'd like to make a motion that we wait on opening the golf courses until the governor lists the restrictions. The second part of that motion is that we open our parks and beaches.
Well,
can we take them one at a time, Norm? On the first motion,
No, it was a one motion.
wait, can I ask you a question, Mike?
yeah,
When you say parks and beaches, I'm very uncomfortable with a playground at this point in time. That's part of a park. I think that there are risks there, and it's not the same as walking on a beach. So I don't know if that's what your intent of that motion was.
My intent is to have our town be on a par with every other town in our area. And you know, very honestly, I haven't seen too many 65 and over year olds going and playing on the gyms and the swing sets. So
That has nothing to do with it. There were a lot of kids on those playgrounds before they closed. And when you say open up the parks, you're opening up the playgrounds. Now, I'm all in favor of.
Tracy,
yeah,
they're open already. I mean, I've been to any number of the facilities in town, and they're being used. And the people that aren't using those are going to the school and using the track and the stuff there. I mean, let's be.
You're not touching anything at the track. At the track, you're walking.
Let's be serious about what has been done here. Nothing's been done but aggravate people.
Well, I'm all in favor of opening the beaches. I've made that clear. I am hesitant when you include parks. You're talking about dog parks. Are we prepared? There's nothing in place for that. So I think your motion has to be clear, and to say to be on par with other towns. The other towns have closed their playgrounds and parks. It's just the only thing that Yarmouth has done that they haven't was the beaches. So I would support that, but I won't support the parks at this time until we know we have everything in place to make sure that that can be opened properly.
I guess I would modify my motion to eliminate the parks at this point.
Second.
I'm not in favor of bundling articles.
I'm not either. Very confusing.
Well, no, it puts you in a position of having to make a choice of agreeing with parts you disagree with or disagreeing with parts you agree with.
Right. That's why you're not in Washington, Eric.
I could just blindly disagree with everything.
You want me to separate them? I'll separate them. I have no problem.
Norm, on the issue of the golf, do you mean to defer the, you don't mean to defer the decision forever? You just defer?
No. I think we need to continue. I'll use this as just a discussion regarding my motion. We need to have Scott continue what he's been doing, the preparation to get the courses ready to open as soon as the restrictions at the state level are lifted, so that we're ready to go at that time.
Is your assumption or your hope that they would be open this weekend, Norman?
I certainly hope that, but you know, I don't think, as further background, that it's worth the risk to endanger our relationship with the Mass Golf Association, or to put ourselves in a situation where we could damage a relationship at the state level. And I just don't think it's worth that risk at this stage. Particularly, with Mass Golf, and as Scott said, we've built a relationship there. We've had some tournaments awarded to us. We have a great facility at Bayberry that has potential in the future to have even more prestigious tournaments. So I think we need to keep that risk in mind. And I think Scott advised that. I think he as much said, look, we've got a good relationship. We could damage that. And I don't think that we should do that. I think that's a very compelling argument that Scott made.
All right, so do we have a second on Norm's motion?
Second.
Okay, any further discussion? Okay, I'm gonna call.
Discussion, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
I feel like we should establish a date, whereas if it's not done by the state, we're going to do it on our own. I think I would be willing to wait and see what happens this weekend. Hopefully they'd open, but if the governor continues to waffle like he has on several of his dates already, it seems like he gives us a date and I feel like he feels like 2 weeks at a time is better than just coming out and saying that it's going to be 3 or 4 months. I feel like we're being strung along at this point. So I don't know if Norm would amend his motion to make it this weekend by the state's action or a date certain.
Certainly, would be happy to amend it to a date certain, but I think we need to allow, probably a week and a half wiggle room.
Well, right now it's May 18th. Right? I mean, isn't
Well,
that?
May 18th, we've been told on more than one occasion that is not the date the light goes on. That's the date in which the Return to Work Task Force will deliver their report. So it could be the 18th, it could be before that. I am reminded that there was a lot of lobbying gone on by the Florist Association. And there's an article in the paper today saying that what were once non-essential businesses as florists, they're now essential because Mother's Day's on the docket here. So there is a lot of activity going on behind the scenes to get certain key elements of the economy going. And it wouldn't surprise me that there's something in the works, because I know since the moment this went down, the golf lobby has been very hard on this topic. And it wouldn't surprise me if some quiet announcements made to allow it to open up sooner rather than later. But I can't give you what that date would be to that point, because to Eric's point, it's the bar keeps moving on us, so.
Do we have a meeting next week?
Yeah, we can. Yeah, I think we should have a meeting next week, only because there's a lot of information kind of trickling out, but we also want to get a few other things in front of you.
I would use that as the next date then.
So a date certain this weekend by the state action, or May 12th on our own action, Norman?
Yes.
That would only apply to Bayberry, because Scott has indicated that Bass River wouldn't be ready until the 18th anyway.
Right.
I would support that amendment if you'd be willing to amend your motion.
Yes, I will amend it in that fashion.
Tracy, with you amend the second?
No, I don't think that that's smart. I think that May 18th is a date that was set. And if we're if we're sitting here saying today that we don't want to go against Mass Golf, but next Tuesday we do, doesn't make sense to me.
Okay, somebody else want a second Norm's motion?
I thought Eric had.
No, I amended. I suggested an amendment. You know, the point about Mass Golf is not lost on me. Maybe we just have the discussion again next week, see what happens this weekend.
Yeah, I think that from my point of view, I think that's a smart way to go, Eric. Is we're meeting, if we're gonna meet next week, let's just put this on the agenda. And give Scott and Dan can give us an update on how we're doing.
It makes sense to me as well. Doesn't hem you in at all. We just put this, we'll just continue this discussion at our next meeting.
Yeah, I think Scott's done a great job. I think the update is very helpful. And as others have said, the relationship with Mass Golf is an important one in a variety of areas. So I think
Can you
that
live
all
with
needs
that,
to be
Norm?
taken. You okay with that, Norm?
Just what, the beaches or the golf?
No, we're still on golf, Norm. Is it okay with you if we just continue this discussion, take a look at where we stand next Tuesday?
I suppose
If
so.
in the meantime, the governor opens the courses, then the question's moot.
Right.
If he
If it doesn't,
doesn't, then,
If it doesn't, we'll go through it all over again.
well, no, you've had the discussion. You probably would see if anybody wanted to make a vote to implement, opening the course.
Okay. That's fine.
Okay, we have a consensus. I don't think we need to vote on that. Okay? Everybody agree?
Agreed.
All right. So let's move on.
Are we gonna vote on the beach?
We are.
Okay.
Norm's making a motion that we open the beaches. I think Tracy, just beaches only, right? Not parks?
Correct.
Yeah, because I think Tracy had a good point about the playgrounds. They had to remove the baskets, the hoops at the basketball court at Old Townhouse, because I guess kids were being close together and playing and stuff like that. But anyway, I think we all agree that walking in open spaces, as long as you observe social distancing, isn't harmful. So we have that motion. Who's seconding that, the beach?
I did.
Tracy? All right. Any further discussion? I'll take a roll call vote. Norm?
Aye.
Tracy?
Aye.
Mark?
Aye.
Eric?
Aye.
I vote aye as well, so that's unanimous. Okay, Norm, thanks for your motion. We'll go to board and committee actions. Upcoming agenda review is next.
Yeah, so we do plan on having a meeting next week, even though the document in your packet says no meeting. We agreed a while ago, about a month ago, that we would meet weekly until this was over. So we'll put some material in front of you at that point. On the 19th, though, is the school will come in and present where we are with the middle school project right now. The building committee met last week by conference, and they are very close to reaching a pretty significant milestone as it relates to getting to the next level on the project. And with the election coming up for the debt exclusion, I think it's important that we put the project back in front of people. So the architectural team and the owner's project manager will give you a overview of where they are at now. One issue did come up in the meeting last week, was the issue about building fees. And I'd asked the chairman of the committee to send the board a letter if they're requesting that some fashion, if all or part of the fees get waived, that it would be on a future agenda item. And for instance, I had Mr. Grills prepare what his cost is in raw labor, if you will. So I think the fees carried on the project are about $170,000 as proposed. And our labor is just short of $50,000 on that. So I said to the chairman, please send the letter over and we'll put it in front of the board for any possible consideration. So we are at the point where a decision has to be made as it relates to what's going to be on and presented to the school board authority for the final phase of the project, if you will, before it goes out to bid. Is that your take on things, Eric? You were, I think, in the meeting too.
Yeah, I was confused as to what they ultimately did with the building permit fees.
I
But
told them to keep it in there.
keep it in there as a budget reduction or as
No.
a line item?
As a line item, correct.
Yeah.
And that was 170?
They're carrying $170,000 for the project.
What was that $50,000 figure you mentioned?
So I'd asked Mr. Grills to provide, based on a project of similar scope, what's the actual amount of labor at a proposed $1 an hour rate? And he was using a $1 an hour rate of just under $46 an hour. He figures it's 600 hours of labor to review the plans and do the inspections and whatnot. And that came in at about $47,100.
Okay, thank you.
So just as a matter of history, back, I think it was on the St. Pius Church project, either for that or as a result of that, back then the Board of Selectmen established a policy to not waive permit fees for projects like that because of the manpower required by the town. There was never any discussion as to prorating it to reflect actual costs. It was just a policy that we weren't going to waive building permit fees for projects that created demands on, the town for, inspectional services and the like. So, I'll defer to the board, but, when I first started on the building committee and that was brought up, I brought up the point to Dan that they can't make that assumption because, that's up to the Board of Selectmen to waive the fee. And, I go back to the policy. The policy was not established to prorate fees based on cost only. It was to not waive these types of building permit fees.
That's my recollection as well. And I mean, we just went through an exercise of cutting 35%, $6 million from our budget. I don't know how we can afford to do that.
No, we depend on the building department and inspectional services for revenues, not just to cover costs.
Well, when I get the letter, I'll put it in front of you for further discussion.
I mean, it's not up to me. I just bring up these points for the board to consider because at some point, a portion or all of that will come before us for consideration.
Well, I appreciate the heads up on that, Eric, and I do recall that I think they had requested a fee waiver, didn't they, when they built the school over there?
Yeah, the church.
I think they wanted. Yeah.
St. Pius Church.
And it was substantial.
Yeah, and we didn't grant it.
No, we did not. And you're right, we didn't break it out on a cost basis either. That doesn't mean we can't, but you're correct. Historically, that's what happened.
Right.
All right.
And unfortunately, it's a big ticket item, and on the building committee is really down to we had the what was it then, a $5 million reduction we had to make due to the escalation that had taken place over the last year and a half or so.
Yep.
So they're really making some hard decisions, and I just didn't want them to consider that an automatic.
Did they ask the architects to reduce their fees? But
I'm sure they didn't.
You would have remembered that.
well, I just wondered, if they think they can ask the town, why wouldn't they ask the architects? I mean, what is the difference? I mean, I don't understand. Are we the ultimate people you can kick around?
Yeah,
I mean,
we're the
have they gone back to the contractor and said, hey, we need another $170,000? I mean, really?
Yeah, what's your cost, Mr. Contractor?
He's no contractor yet.
no, there's no. I mean, it has.
You know,
They've done preliminary estimating. I think they have a couple of independent estimators, that are working to, fine tune the budget, but it hasn't gone out to bid yet.
I mean, the fees are the fees.
Right.
And it's just part of the cost of building a project. So,
Exactly.
I think they should look to somebody else.
That was the direction that we gave them. I don't know, Dan, was it 2 or 3 months ago now?
Yeah, I want to say it was early February, or late January.
So, I mean, maybe Dan, you should.
I don't mind just telling them to forget it. That's fine.
Yeah.
That's what I mean, the last time we discussed it, it needed, it was represented to me that we should have a discussion about it. So that's where we were at. And I said, well, we're not going to start the discussion unless we get an official ask from the school district.
Well, it's coming, unless we squash it.
Unless we start, which we can do. That's fine.
Right. Yeah,
I think, rather than put us in a position of being the bad guys, I think we ought to ask them to not send a letter.
That's fine.
Yeah.
But I mean,
I think it's important for us to be consistent too.
Well, this is helpful because I was not aware of the Pope Pius situation. But that being said, I'm also operate under, the board as individuals have their own particular opinions. And perhaps if we weren't in the pandemic situation, maybe there would be a little bit of a different viewpoint on this. But that all being said, if it sounds like the sentiment per individual is that we don't even want to entertain it, I can stop it now.
I would prefer not to entertain it, but I'm just one person.
That's what I mean.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
I mean, I think that they have the right to ask, like everybody else. I don't know if we could tell them not to ask, but I wouldn't support it based on our being consistent with our policy. Is 170 the full amount, or is that just our?
Just an estimate. They won't know until the whole building is.
What about Dennis's portion of that?
Well, it's a current inside Yarmouth. So, I mean, so there, theoretically, as part of the project goes, there would be a percentage split on that 35%. But it was at the point where they are down to taking some hard votes on getting under that $5 million cap. So,
right.
It does come down to, and I don't like to be like that, but if it's, well, we got to spend money on that, we won't be able to do this. And that's kind of how that conversation was going the other night.
You still have 2 offices? You still have a turf field?
No, the turf field. Eric, how did that, I'm not sure on the field. I think they ditched the field idea.
Yeah, I think, I'm not happy with the way this is coming out, to be honest with you. And I think that some people that were in on that meeting share that sentiment. It's just, there's a lot of sacrifices being made, and it's unfortunate. I don't think it's a fabulous plan, but here we are.
So,
but yeah, there are no fields. All the fields at Station Ave Elementary, and Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, but all those fields are being lost. We're getting down to whether or not we're going to do irrigation.
Right.
And it's It's an interesting process.
So what are they going to bring those back as future projects?
Well, there was some conversation associated with that,
There appears to be a plan. I don't know if you're privy to the plan, Dan, but I am not. But there appears to be some master plan behind the scenes to get some either additional fields or improved fields.
I'm not aware of that.
I think Carol and Ken and Paul made reference to something in the future that was being worked on to kind of supplement the things that had been lost. I could be wrong. That was just my interpretation of some of the things that were said.
So they'll be here on the 19th. And the next correction on the calendar would be the June 9th date. Actually, on June 2nd, I'd like to have you consider the public hearing for the budget where the school would come to the meeting and present their budget, because they hadn't had a chance to do that. And then capital budget and finance committee also at the same time. And that's a noticed public hearing. So we put a notice in the paper for that.
June 9th.
No, the 2nd. We need to have enough time if we're going to end up sticking to June 22nd for town meeting to generate the warrant.
Anything else on agenda review?
Mr. Chairman, with respect to the agenda for our next meeting on the 12th, how is that shaping up? We're going to revisit where we stand with the Governor's Advisory Committee and golf. Dan, you said can you just give us a recap on?
Yeah, I mean, so this whole conversation about what's going on with the governor's orders and whatnot, it's kind of fluid at this point. So, I mean, I don't have anything concrete other than the golf topic now. And then what we wanted to do is bring some more budgetary information to you.
Okay.
I mean, it could be something like, I don't have to post the agendas, till late in the week next week, and we could play it by ear to see if there's something worthwhile to have it. But we would like to get some guidance on the budget, understanding that it's a heavy lift to get it in position for a June 2nd public hearing.
Okay.
We're going to talk about the agenda. If
In
we
the
see
warrant too.
how the legislation
Yeah.
goes on that, to see whether about
Right.
streamlining the agenda. for
Yeah,
the
and
warrant
it would
and
give
for
you an
the warrant.
example of what the proposed warrant looks like.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's unclear to me is if the petitioners have to put the petitioned articles, or we have to keep the petitioned articles on the annual warrant, and there's an understanding that things will get moved to the fall. Do they have to go after signatures again, or are we able to sort of automatically just move those?
No,
think
it
that
has
is
to
the warrant.
appear in the
Definitely
warrant.
postpone.
And then depending upon how town meeting lays out, a motion would have to be made to indefinitely postpone it, so that it can come up again.
Okay, so, but they won't have to do anything. Those articles on their own could appear.
No,
in the fall
because they
warrant?
did qualify to get onto the warrant. Yeah,
So would we have to IP it with the date certain, or?
I think it's indefinite.
No, I don't think that would be right, because we've had petition articles definitely postponed that never came back before. So I think the way that we would do it is we'd have to sponsor it.
Yeah, I agree with you, Tracy. I think that needs to be clarified, Dan.
Well, I'll get that clarified for you.
Okay, yeah, I think that would be helpful, because I don't want to find out at the last minute that
Understood.
there's a procedure or step that we've missed.
If they postponed it to the next town meeting, that might be appropriate. But if they
Yeah.
definitely postpone it, that's not to a date certain, we wouldn't have to put on a warrant unless we sponsored it, which means they'd have to get the signatures again. So,
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I'm concerned about is something falling through the cracks here. If they're in good faith agreeing to put it off until the fall, I just don't want procedurally for us to screw that up somehow. The other question I would pitch is there any objection to doing the legal services review on the 12th? We've had that up and down, back and forth. We've been moving that around. It was going to be tonight, but then it dropped off. I just assume try to get that squared away as well on the 12th.
Yeah, I'd ask just what is it that you're looking to get on that legal services review? What specifically are you looking for?
Well, I had suggested a while ago that what we do is we look at the legal services and look at procuring.
I mean, so is it something where you want to get into a new agreement with for fiscal year starting upcoming?
Yeah, I think it would be helpful to go out and test the market again to see where we are in terms of legal services. Might there be an opportunity to look at? I wasn't involved in the last selection process, but I'm a traditional believer that every few years, with respect to professional services, you go out there and I'm going to propose later on that with respect to engineering services, we have the same discussion, but I would like to see an RFP or an RFQ on legal services coming up soon.
So it was, I believe, 2016, the last time that was done.
2016, correct?
Yeah, before I was here. Yep.
Right before you were here.
That's correct.
It's time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's important for professional services. I think, the same thing should apply to audit firms as well. It's you're pointing out engineering, Mark. That's any major professional service should be reviewed every 3, 4, 5 years, whatever the board agrees on.
Well, we do that with engineering services. We do what's referred to as an on-call request for proposal, and it's for a period of typically 2 years. And we get a menu of proposed town services, and we put it out for advertisement. And the engineering public responds to that. They give us the unit price, if you will, for labor services for all of the requested services we ask for. And then when a project is proposed, we can take that project and put it out to our own in-house list for specific solicitation. So this is a way to make sure that we don't always have to rely on the same engineer, but it also keeps them honest because they're competing against a pretty significant pool of competitors at the local level because we procured it locally.
how much time does writing a RFQ take? I'm concerned about Rich's time right now.
It take a lot of time.
And, we got the budget. I just don't know if this is the right time to distract Rich from doing everything he needs to do before he leaves to get the budget set.
Well, the RFQ really doesn't take that much to write. It's not that complicated, and they're off the shelf, so they're pretty easy to put together. So, I mean, I've written them before.
Are you volunteering?
I'd be happy to. If you want to take my services, I'm sure. I'll draft it for you. So that's what I'd like to see if we can get that on the agenda for the 12th. If unless there's an objection to it, I'd just like to make that pitch.
Well, I can't promise that I'll have a proposal for you to review by the 12th.
Okay.
But certainly if you give me a vote that that's what the board wants to do, then we'll have to get in position to do the solicitation so that it coincides with the first of the fiscal year or some period thereafter, shortly thereafter.
Oh. So we could vote on it then.
Yeah. I mean, if that's the decision as to what you want it to do, yeah.
Anything else on that?
No, not on the agenda. Right now, like I said, we're on a wait and see approach to whether or not we can even have a town meeting with real people there,
You know what I just
Well,
thought of,
thank
not
you.
as an agenda item, but you know, the course that Phil Magnuson normally puts on for the restaurants?
Yeah,
He usually does it in the month of May. Obviously, that's not gonna happen, and it's, I'm even wondering if we can do it before the season starts, or even,
Can you do it on Zoom?
yeah, we could probably do it on Zoom. I'll talk to Phil about that and see what we could do that would be a way to get it done. I'm also kind of hopeful that if we're allowed to do like gatherings of 10 or so people in a large enough space, that you could set people up. I do know there's planning like that going on now with academic institutions in bars and restaurants about, if you can.
yeah, but you couldn't have
space.
Phil keep coming back. You'd probably have to try to videotape the first one.
Could do that, yeah.
And then have people
Yeah.
come in after that. He does a terrific job. The other thing is the Yarmouth Restaurant Association usually puts something on in late June, right before the season, which is another very, very good program. I don't know if they're gonna be able to do it. I'll check on that and report back.
There's no consent agenda or anything like that, so.
No consent agenda and no appointments by you, Mark, right?
No, we're done on appointments. But I want to, Tracy just raised something. The financial balance sheet for Comcast.
That's
is
an
on
annual
here?
report they send every year,
Okay.
they're required to
It's
do
an
that.
FYI from them to
Yeah.
us, I guess.
Right.
Okay.
Although Rich, I believe, has been in contact with our attorney associated with cable, and he's ready to engage Comcast, so.
That's good.
And do you have any updates?
No, that's, Rich, there was some conversation back and forth. One of the problems with the situation we're in with DHY is we wouldn't be able to take advantage of a stimulus package. I mean, I thought Selectman Holcomb raised a great point. If Bass River, for whatever reason, is down, now would be the time to do something. But without having the enabling legislation that sets up a commission over the finish line, it's hard to do anything. So, Rich, is there any more talk? I know that the RAC had a back and forth, or at least a couple members associated with getting in a position so that we could take advantage of a stimulus proposal.
We've got to convene a RAC meeting. I was trying to poll a couple, the chairman and the vice chairman. We haven't finalized that, but I'll have to follow up and see what that looks like, because we should at least get an update and inform them as to the status of the articles and how they'd like to proceed and move forward.
Yeah.
With what they had been contemplating and what the status it looks like with DHY. It looks like the other communities are putting it off the vote at this point, which gives us time to finalize some of the issues we had been discussing. So, but the big consideration, if those are on the warrant or on the docket for this upcoming meeting, would be: do you want to position? Do you want to move forward with some level of planning, design, and limited construction money on Route 28, so that in the event of a stimulus package that might be forthcoming, that you could take advantage of that, because generally they need to be shovel ready. And we're on West Yarmouth, we're just about there because that was already designed, but we need to update that and finalize that, but we'd have to get design for the rest of it. So that's the discussion the RAC has to have, as well as just a general update. We had a lot of things in the queue with the RAC. So I just need to get together with them before the end of the month and kind of give them the list of items we were working on.
Rich, can I just ask a question for you on this stuff? I'd be curious to know how long it would take to tee up the Bass River wastewater recharge site to follow up on Norm's proposal or suggestion. Is how long would it take for us to get through the design, permitting, and get that project so that it is shovel ready? Be helpful to know how much it would cost and how much time would be needed, because that's obviously, you know, if we're gonna make a decision on DHY in the fall, let's say, I mean, that could be potentially a stimulus. That could be a potential candidate project as
Right.
well for the group.
I'll move
Yeah, that would be helpful to know.
And I don't want to overburden Scott either, but, you know, part of that discussion would be, is there engaging the Gulf Enterprise Committee and the rest of the community for that matter? You know, if we want to do anything above and beyond what we have to do or required to do.
Right.
You know, so, you know, I know the
Well-
golf course architect has come up with some plans, and I did see some emails relatively recently to that effect, so we gotta pull that together and start moving that forward again.
Because I'm trying to think what other things within the category of wastewater could be close to being shovel ready. And
Well, I submitted all
unless I'm
of
mistaken,
phase
what's that?
one. When we put
All
something
of
together
phase
for the
one?
commission, we put all of phase one, we just broke it down into smaller pieces parts.
I see.
And we had some culvert and some joint projects with Friends of Bass River that we were able to put in. So we have some substantial projects that we've suggested, and we still have time to go back and add to that list, I'm sure.
Got it.
Matter of being ready to do that.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, I skipped over selectmen's items, but that's okay. Norm, do you have anything?
Not at this point.
Eric,
Nothing, thank you.
Tracy,
No, all set, thank you.
Mark?
I'm said, thank you.
I'll pass as well. We have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Yes. All right, roll call. Norm?
Aye.
Tracy?
Aye.
Mark?
Aye.
Eric?
Aye.
I vote aye. We're adjourned. Thank you very much.